Hi guys and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we hook the listener with vivid present tense imagery related to the topic. Drop one cheeky, you probably won't survive this style reality check. You're stepping into a frozen frontier evening in 1865, where the wilderness feels close enough to breathe on your neck. The air is sharp, the kind that stings your nostrils and makes every sound travel too far in the quiet. You might think you're prepared for a night like this. But out here, preparation is always slightly optimistic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Invite viewers to post their location and local time out here. The frontier is not romantic, it is patient, cold, and endlessly watchful. Every creak of wood feels like a reminder that the wilderness does not care about comfort. You're not just listening to a story, you are stepping into it. Now, dim the lights. You arrive just as the land begins to lose its colour, not in a poetic way that feels gentle, but in a way that feels like the world is quietly shutting one eye at a time. The wagon tracks behind you are already softening under a thin dusting of early snow, and the horse exhales steam that vanishes into the grey air like it was never there. Ahead sits a solitary log cabin, its shape uneven against the tree line, built from timber that still carries the memory of axe cuts and summer sweat. This kind of cabin was common during the westward expansion of the United States in the mid-19th century, especially around 1865 when homesteaders pushed deeper into unsettled territory. Many were built quickly, sometimes in days, using whatever wood could be felled nearby. That historical fact is something historians agree on fairly well, even if they still debate how standardized or improvised these shelters truly were across different regions. You step closer, boots pressing into the ground that feels half frozen, half reluctant. The cabin door hangs slightly crooked, and smoke leaks from a chimney that seems to struggle with its own purpose. Inside, you already imagine the small world waiting for you. A table, a stove, a bed of rough blankets, maybe a lantern flickering like a patient heartbeat. But before you enter, the wilderness makes itself known in small ways. A distant branch snaps, too deliberate to be accidental. You pause, listening. Some settlers once swore they could tell the difference between animal movement and something else entirely, something they never quite had words for. That idea survived in frontier folklore, where even a wind could feel like intention. You finally push the door open. Warm air spills out, thick with the scent of wood smoke and old ash. The interior is smaller than expected, as if the walls have been slowly inching inward since the day they were built. Floorboards are uneven, and you notice a shallow groove near the threshold worn by years of boots entering and leaving, each one carrying a different version of survival. You set your things down carefully. The sound feels too loud, almost disrespectful in the quiet. A single iron stove sits in the corner, still faintly warm, suggesting someone was here not long ago, or perhaps that the cold simply never fully leaves once it arrives. You cannot decide which explanation feels more comforting. Outside, the light continues to drain from the sky. It is not yet night, but the frontier does not wait for formalities. It simply dims when it feels like it. You glance through the small window, noticing how the trees seem closer now than they did earlier, as if the forest has shifted its stance while you are not looking. There is a quirky little frontier tidbit that often surprises people. Some homesteaders reportedly kept small animals like squirrels or birds in loft spaces during storms, not as pets in a modern sense, but as accidental companions that found their way inside and refused to leave. Whether that was practical survival behaviour or simply romanticised storytelling added later is still unclear. And historians still argue whether such accounts reflect everyday reality or selective memory preserved in diaries. You kneel near the stove and check the wood supply. It is stacked neatly, almost too neatly, suggesting either careful preparation or someone who had too much time alone with their thoughts. You place a log inside and listen to the slow catch of flame as it wakes the metal into a soft orange glow. The light changes everything it touches, turning the rough wood walls into something almost gentle. The wind outside begins to shift, not yet strong, but no longer casual either. It presses against the cabin in testing waves, like something trying to decide how much attention it wants to give you tonight. You sit back for a moment and let your eyes adjust to the dim interior. In this period of frontier history, winter storms were not rare, but they were unpredictable in intensity, often arriving faster than travel routes could prepare for. That uncertainty shaped daily life in ways modern weather forecasts make hard to imagine. People learn to read skies, animal behaviour, and even silence itself as warning systems. You settle into a chair near the fire. The wood pops softly, and for a moment, everything feels contained. But containment on the frontier is always temporary. The cabin is safe, yes, but safety out here is never a permanent condition. It is more like a pause between uncertainties. A faint sound travels across the roof, like a hand brushing snow that has not yet fully decided to fall. You look up instinctively, then laugh quietly at yourself for expecting answers from a ceiling of timber. Still, you listen a little longer than necessary. Some frontier accounts mention that settlers believed storms carried moods, as if weather itself had a temperament. That belief, part superstition and part observation, coloured how people describe nights like this. Whether that reflects psychological coping or early environmental intuition is still debate, and historians still argue whether such interpretations reveal more about nature or about the people trying to survive it. You shift your weight, feeling the exhaustion of travel begin to settle into your bones. Outside, the last trace of daylight disappears completely, and the cabin becomes its own small universe of heat and shadow. The wilderness does not retreat. It simply waits, patient and unblinking. The first real gust of wind arrives then, pressing against the walls with a low, testing groan. The cabin responds like something alive, not breaking, but acknowledging force. You realise this is only the beginning of the night, and already the world outside is changing its mind about how calm it intends to remain. Still, inside this small wooden refuge, there is warmth, there is fire, there is the soft certainty of being temporarily out of reach. And for now, that is enough to sit with, to breathe with, to let the storm gather its thoughts beyond the walls while you remain inside the fragile comfort of timber and flame. You step fully inside now, letting the door settle behind you with a soft wooden complaint that feels older than it should. The warmth hits your face first, not comforting in a modern sense, but thick and uneven, like the cabin is breathing out whatever heat it managed to hold on to during the day. It smells of smoke, sap, old ash, and something faintly metallic from the stove that has seen too many winters to pretend it is new. Your eyes take a moment to adjust. The light inside is dim, filtered through a small window that seems more like a suggestion of transparency than a true opening to the outside world. Shadows cling to every corner. The room is one open space pretending to be several. A stove in one corner, a rough table near the centre, a bed pushed against the far wall, everything arranged not for comfort, but for survival efficiency. This is how many frontier log cabins in the mid-19th century were constructed, especially during the westward movement that accelerated around 1865. A single main room was the norm for early homesteads, with expansion coming only if families survived long enough to build it. That is a mainstream historical fact most historians agree on, even if the emotional reality of those spaces is harder to reconstruct with certainty. You take a slow step forward. The floorboards creak beneath your boots, uneven in a way that makes your balance feel slightly negotiated rather than guaranteed. You notice the chinking between logs, the filler material pressed into gaps. It looks like a mix of clay, moss, and whatever else could be found nearby. It is not uniform, it is not pretty, but it is doing its job, holding back the wind in a way that feels almost heroic when you think about it too long. A small table sits near the centre. It is scratched, worn, and slightly tilted as if it has spent years compensating for the uneven ground beneath it. On it rests a tin cup and a dull knife. Someone left them with the quiet confidence of routine, not urgency. You wonder how many hands have touched this surface before yours. You wonder how many winters it has survived without complaint. You set your belongings down carefully again, more out of instinct than necessity. The sound of fabric brushing wood feels loud in the stillness. The cabin seems to notice every movement you make, as if it is learning you piece by piece. The stove draws your attention next. It is cast iron, heavy, practical, and slightly soot-blackened. A few embers still glow inside, suggesting recent use. You kneel and study it, noticing how the metal radiates a steady, patient heat that spreads unevenly through the room. One side feels warm, the other still carries the memory of cold. That imbalance is strangely comforting. You add a bit of wood, watching the flame respond slowly, as if it has to consider whether it trusts you yet. The crackle breaks the silence in a way that feels almost conversational. In frontier life, stoves like this were central to survival. They were not just for cooking, but for heating, drying clothes, and even melting snow for water. Many settlers considered them the heart of the cabin. That is a widely accepted historical interpretation, though historians still argue whether early homesteaders prioritized heating efficiency or cooking versatility when selecting stove designs. You stand and brush your hands together, feeling the dryness of the air inside. It is warmer than outside, but not evenly so. Heat pools near the stove and fades quickly as it reaches the walls. You can almost map the temperature in your mind like invisible weather inside the room. Your attention drifts to the bed. It is simple, almost austere. A wooden frame with a thin mattress stuffed with straw, or possibly dried grass. The bedding looks heavy, layered with thick wool blankets that carry the faint scent of lanolin and smoke. You imagine nights spent under them, listening to storms like the one forming outside, feeling the cabin shift and settle with it frees us. A quirky detail from frontier accounts sometimes mentions how settlers would use heated stones wrapped in cloth to warm beds before sleeping. Not every cabin had them, and their effectiveness varied, but the practice appears often enough in diaries to suggest it was more than just folklore. Whether it was widespread or regionally specific is still debated, and historians still argue whether such heating methods were common practice or occasional improvisation, recorded more vividly than it was lived. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the table again, noticing small grooves carved into the wood. Some are accidental, others feel deliberate, like someone marking time in a place where time does not behave normally. The cabin has the atmosphere of repetition. Eat, sleep, wait, endure, repeat until seasons stop feeling like separate things. Outside, the wind begins to shift again, but here inside it is reduced to a low presence, more suggestion than force. Still, you can feel it through the walls, like the cabin is translating weather into vibration. You notice hooks along one wall holding a coat, a lantern, and a coil of rope. Each object is placed with intention, suggesting someone understood the importance of order in a place where chaos was always nearby. The rope in particular draws your attention. It is thick, slightly frayed, and worn smooth in places by repeated handling. You think about how frontier cabins were often built by their occupants using nearby timber and improvised tools. Nails were sometimes reused or forged locally. Glass windows were a luxury in many regions. That is a mainstream historical fact. Though historians still argue whether such cabins represent standardized frontier architecture or a wide spectrum of individual improvisation shaped by geography and resource availability. A small shelf above the table holds a few supplies. Dried beans in a cloth sack, a tin of salt, a candle stub already half melted into itself. Nothing here is abundant. Everything is measured. You sit for a moment on the edge of the bed. It gives slightly under your weight, releasing a faint rustle of straw. The sound is oddly intimate, as if the bed is acknowledging you. You pause, listening to the cabin settle around you. Every structure has its own version of silence. This one is not empty, it is layered. A mouse scurries somewhere behind the wall. You freeze instinctively, then relax. Small animals were common in frontier cabins, often slipping through gaps in logs or nesting in insulation materials like moss or cloth scraps. Some settlers tolerated them. Others tried to discourage them with traps or noise. Whether they were considered pests or minor companions depended heavily on circumstance and scarcity. A detail often mentioned in diaries that historians still argue whether it reflects practical survival attitudes or emotional adaptation to isolation. You lean back slightly, letting your gaze drift upward toward the ceiling beams. They are rough, unplaned, still bearing the marks of tools that shaped them. You can almost see the effort embedded in them, the labour of cutting, lifting, fitting, and hoping it would all hold. The cabin feels less like a building and more like a memory made solid. Every surface carries traces of decision. Every object is placed because something else was sacrificed for it. Space, time, comfort, or ease. The stove clicks softly as it expands with heat. Outside, the wind rises again, pressing lightly against the walls. Not yet a storm, but no longer just weather either. It is building its argument slowly, patiently, like it has all night to convince the cabin to listen. You remain seated, letting your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the room in this small frontier space. Nothing is silent, but everything is contained. And that containment, fragile as it is, becomes its own kind of shelter as the wilderness gathers itself just beyond the logs. You remain seated for a moment, feeling the cabin settle around you in its uneven way. But your attention keeps drifting toward the small window. It is not much more than a square of imperfect glass set into thick logs, slightly fogged at the edges, where cold and warmth argue without resolution. Beyond it, the world is beginning to change shape. At first, it is subtle. The tree line that once looked distinct now seems softer, like it is being smudged by an unseen hand. The sky, which earlier held a dull winter grey, starts to deepen into something heavier, denser, more layered. You can almost feel the weight of it even from inside the cabin, as if the atmosphere itself is lowering its shoulders. You step closer to the window. Your breath briefly fogs the glass, then fades. Outside, the clouds are no longer scattered. They are gathering, not rushing, not chaotic, but slow and deliberate, like a tide returning to claim ground it already knows. In frontier winters, this kind of sky was often a warning long before modern forecasting existed. A mainstream historical fact is that during the 1860s, weather prediction in North America was still in its early development. The United States would not establish a formal national weather service until after this period, when telegraph networks began to allow storm data to be shared across distances. Before that, settlers and travellers relied on observation, memory, and word of mouth carried along rough communication lines. That shift from intuition to systemized forecasting is something historians generally agree marked a major turning point in how people related to weather. Out here, though, none of that future structure exists yet. You are inside a world where clouds still feel personal. You watch as the sky darkens further. The clouds are not uniform. They roll in uneven layers, some thin enough to glow faintly with the last remnants of daylight, others thick enough to swallow that light entirely. It creates a strange effect, as if the horizon is being erased in sections. A faint gust presses against the cabin wall. You feel it more than hear it, a low pressure that travels through the logs and into the floor beneath your feet. The cabin responds with a quiet creak, like it is acknowledging something it would rather not discuss. Outside, the first hints of snow begin to appear, though not yet fully committed. Just a few drifting flakes, hesitant and sparse, like the sky is testing the idea of winter rather than fully declaring it. You notice how your perception of distance changes. The trees that once felt a short walk away now seem further, as if the space between you and them has stretched slightly. Frontier settlers often describe this sensation in diaries, where approaching storms altered not just visibility, but the emotional sense of geography. There is a quirky tidbit from frontier oral traditions that says some homesteaders believed certain cloud formations could predict the storm's personality. Low, flat clouds meant a slow, lingering snow. Tall, stacked formations were said to bring sudden, violent wind shifts. While this was never scientifically accurate, it appeared frequently in personal journals and passed down stories, blending observation with imagination in ways that are hard to separate today. You shift your weight and glance back toward the stove, checking the small glow of embers. The warmth inside the cabin feels slightly more important now, as if it has gained value simply because the outside world is becoming less hospitable. Heat becomes not just comfort, but definition. Inside versus outside, safe versus exposed. Another gust arrives, stronger this time. The window frame rattles softly. Dust or ash inside the chimney shifts with a faint whispering sound. You find yourself listening more closely than before, not because you are afraid, but because the environment demands attention in increments now. In the broader context of the 1860s frontier expansion, storms like this played a significant role in shaping settlement patterns. Travel routes could be delayed for days or even weeks depending on snowfall intensity. That is a mainstream historical understanding supported by many settler accounts and military logs from the period, especially those documenting movement across unsettled territories. You imagine what it would have been like to be caught outside in this moment. No cabin, no stove, just distance shrinking into whiteness. The thought is not dramatic, it's just practical, like calculating how long a body could reasonably keep moving before needing to stop. Outside, the clouds continue their slow descent. They are now thick enough that the sky no longer feels above you in the usual sense. It feels closer, almost layered over the land like a heavy cloth being drawn tighter. You notice a shift in sound. The forest is no longer quiet in the same way. There are subtle movements, branches adjusting under wind pressure, distant cracks of ice forming on limbs. Some settlers once claimed they could hear storms arriving through changes in forest sound long before snowfall began. Whether that was accurate perception or psychological pattern recognition is still debated, and historians still argue whether such accounts reflect environmental sensitivity or retrospective storytelling shaped by memory. You move away from the window and back toward the center of the cabin. The floorboards feel slightly colder now, as if the chill is finding new pathways inside. The stove remains steady, but its glow seems smaller in comparison to the expanding darkness outside. For a moment, you simply stand there, letting your eyes adjust again. The interior feels more enclosed than before, not physically smaller, but perceptually tighter. Storms have a way of doing that. They compress space without changing its measurements. Another faint detail catches your attention. The smell of pine and smoke seems stronger now, as if the cabin is sealing itself more firmly, recycling its own air. You breathe slowly, noticing how even respiration feels like part of the environment's rhythm. A second historical note worth considering is that many frontier cabins were intentionally built with minimal openings to reduce heat loss during winter. Small windows, tight door frames, and low ceilings were common design features. That is a widely accepted architectural adaptation of the time, though historians still argue whether these design choices were primarily driven by necessity, resource scarcity, or inherited building traditions from European settlers. You sit back down near the stove, but your focus remains outward. The storm is not fully here yet, but it is no longer approaching either. It is arriving in stages, like a thought forming slowly in the sky. The wind outside rises again, this time holding longer in its pressure against the logs, The cabin answers with a deeper creak, one that travels along the walls and ceiling like a slow conversation between materials. You find yourself noticing patterns in it, the intervals between gusts, the brief silences that feel almost intentional, the way the forest seems to pause before each movement resumes. It is easy to imagine how early settlers developed narratives around storms, giving them intention simply because unpredictability demanded meaning. You lean back slightly, eyes half focused on the dim interior, while your mind keeps tracking the shifting world beyond the walls. The clouds are now fully dominant. The last suggestion of clear sky has disappeared. Outside, the first real accumulation of snow begins, not dramatic yet, but steady enough to suggest commitment. And inside, the cabin holds its small circle of warmth a little tighter, as if aware that the night has officially begun its slow transformation into something far less forgiving and far more complete. The snow outside has begun to commit itself in a more serious way now, not yet a full storm, but no longer hesitant either. You sit near the stove for a moment longer, watching the glow settle into its steady rhythm. Then you make a decision that feels simple but carries weight in this kind of place. Firewood matters, more than comfort, more than routine. It is the difference between a manageable night and a long, unforgiving one. You rise slowly, feeling the shift in temperature as you move away from the stove's small circle of heat. The cabin seems to notice your movement, the way old wooden structures always do, responding with faint creaks that travel through beams and floorboards like quiet commentary. You reach for your coat, thick and worn, smelling faintly of smoke that never fully leaves frontier clothing. Then you open the door. The cold does not arrive gently. It presses in immediately, filling your lungs and tightening the edges of your awareness. The world outside has changed in the short time you were inside. Snow now drifts with more confidence, and the wind moves through the trees with a low, continuous presence. The cabin behind you feels suddenly smaller, as if it has retreated into itself for protection. You step onto the packed ground, boots sinking slightly into a thin layer of fresh snow. The air is sharper here, almost metallic in its clarity. Sounds carry differently too. The forest is not silent, but its voice has changed, reduced to distant creaks, shifting branches, and the occasional soft collapse of snow falling from limbs. The woodpile sits a short distance from the cabin, partially covered by a rough tarp that flaps lightly in the wind. You approach it with steady steps, noticing how the storm seems to measure your movement without interfering yet. You take an axe from its resting place against a post. The handle is smooth from use, shaped subtly by countless repetitions of human effort. You begin to split wood. Each strike lands with a satisfying resistance, followed by the clean release of timber separating along its grain. The sound is sharp but not loud in a way that feels disruptive. It blends into the storm rather than competing with it. After a few moments, your breathing settles into a rhythm that matches the motion of your arms. In the mid-19th century frontier settlements, firewood collection was not just daily labour but seasonal planning. People often gathered and split wood in large quantities before deep winter set in, storing it in covered piles to ensure survival through storms like this one. Contemporary accounts from homesteaders consistently emphasize how central this preparation was to winter endurance. Without it, even a well-built cabin could become unlivable within hours. That is a widely accepted interpretation among historians studying frontier subsistence practices, though some researchers note that regional differences in climate and resource availability likely created more variation in preparation habits than earlier studies assumed. You pause briefly, adjusting your grip, and glance toward the tree line. The snow there looks thicker now, as if the forest is slowly being erased from the edges inward. A gust passes through, and for a moment, everything leans in the same direction. Trees, drifting snow, even your own posture adjusting instinctively. A small frontier curiosity comes to mind as you continue working. Some settlers reportedly believed that placing split logs with the grain facing a certain direction could influence how evenly they burned. Others insisted that stacking wood in alternating patterns improved heat retention in storage piles. Whether these practices had any real effect is uncertain, but they appear frequently in personal journals and oral accounts, blending practical experimentation with inherited superstition in a way that defined much of frontier life. The axe rises and falls again. Your arms begin to warm despite the cold air, a contrast that feels almost strange, as if your body is creating its own weather to compensate for the environment around you. Snow collects lightly on your shoulders, melting slightly before freezing again in thin patches. The wind grows more assertive, not violent yet, but no longer exploratory. It moves through the clearing in longer breaths, pressing against the woodpile in the cabin behind you. You can feel the structure of the cabin through that distance, as if it is calling you back without words. You stack the split logs carefully, building a small but growing supply. Each piece feels heavier than expected, not because of weight alone, but because of what it represents. Every log is a measured portion of future warmth, future safety, future stillness. Firewood in this era was more than a resource. It was a form of planning against uncertainty. Many historical reconstructions of frontier life show that households often structured entire days around the acquisition and processing of fuel. That understanding is broadly supported by archaeological findings and written records, though some academic interpretations suggest that the emotional significance of such labour may have been understated in official accounts focused more on economics than lived experience. You continue until your hands feel the first dull ache of effort settling in. Not painful, but insistent enough to remind you that endurance here is physical as much as mental. The storm continues its slow build-up around you. Snow now falling at a steadier rate, the world softening at the edges. For a moment, you stop again and listen. The forest does not feel empty. It feels occupied by motion you cannot fully track. Settlers often describe this sensation in winter storms, where visibility reduced not only sight but certainty itself. What was once familiar space becomes interpretive, requiring trust in memory more than observation. You gather the last of the split wood into your arms. The stack is uneven, some pieces longer, some freshly fractured, edges still bright where the axe cut cleanly through grain. You turn back toward the cabin. The warmth inside feels almost visible now, glowing faintly through the window like an invitation. You move toward it, each step compressing snow beneath your boots in a soft, consistent rhythm. Behind you, the woodpile stands slightly diminished but more organized, a small act of order imposed against the growing disorder of weather. As you reach the door, a final gust passes through the clearing. It presses lightly against your back, not forceful, but insistent enough to remind you that the outside world is still speaking. You open the door and step back inside. The change is immediate. Heat wraps around you in uneven layers. Warm near the stove, cooler near the walls, but all of it feels like shelter compared to the sharp clarity outside. You set the firewood down carefully, listening to the soft thud of it joining the growing supply. For a moment, you remain standing there, letting the transition settle in your body. The cabin creaks softly, as if acknowledging your return. The storm continues beyond the logs, now fully engaged in its slow, expanding presence. You look at the woodpile, then toward the stove, already imagining how the night will continue to unfold. Each log a small promise against the deepening winter outside. You set the last of the firewood down inside the cabin, and for a moment you simply stand there listening to the small sounds of settling timber and distant wind pressure. The warmth from the stove begins to reclaim your fingers slowly, like it is negotiating with the cold rather than defeating it outright. Outside, the storm has moved past preparation and into presence. At first, it is only the snow that changes. The flakes that were once hesitant now arrive with more confidence, no longer drifting in isolation, but gathering in small clusters that move together like they have agreed on direction. You glance through the window again. The glass is fogging more quickly now, and the world beyond it is starting to lose definition. This is the point in many frontier winter accounts where observers begin to describe the weather not as a backdrop but as an active force. Period journals from the mid-19th century frequently note how snowstorms seem to alter the perceived shape of the land, turning familiar distances into uncertain estimates. That observation is broadly supported by environmental historians in studying how early settlers experienced seasonal isolation, especially in regions where snowfall could persist for days without interruption. You notice it yourself now, the tree line is still there, but it feels less like a boundary and more like a suggestion. The space between cabin and forest is filling in, slowly but steadily, as if the land is being rewritten in softer lines. Outside, the wind begins to rise in a more deliberate way. Not chaotic yet, but structured, like it is testing different paths around the cabin before deciding where to apply pressure. The logs respond with subtle creaks, each one travelling through the structure in a different rhythm. You start to understand that the cabin does not block the storm so much as translate it. You move closer to the stove, letting the heat settle into your coat. The fire crackles softly, and the sound feels almost conversational in the enclosed space. In frontier life, this kind of stove fire was often described as the centre of both physical survival and daily rhythm. Archaeological studies of homestead sites consistently show heavy use of central heating points in single-room dwellings, reinforcing the idea that heat sources dictated how space was lived in rather than how it was designed. A small detail catches your attention as you listen to the wind. The snow against the window is no longer sparse. It is becoming continuous, a shifting curtain rather than individual flakes. Each movement outside now blends into the next, creating a texture instead of distinct events. You sit down slowly on the edge of the bed again, feeling the cabin's uneven floor adjust slightly beneath you. The straw inside the mattress rustles faintly. Everything inside feels quieter now, not because sound has diminished, but because outside noise has expanded to fill more of the world. There is a curious frontier observation recorded in several personal diaries from this era. Some settlers believed that the first sustained snowfall of the season had a distinct sound when it met wood structures, a kind of soft hissing or whispering that differed from lighter flurries. Whether that perception reflects actual acoustic differences or heightened sensory awareness during isolation is still debated among researchers who study environmental perception in historical contexts. Though no consensus has fully settled the question, you tilt your head slightly, listening more carefully now. It is subtle, but there is indeed a layered sound outside, wind brushing snow against logs, snow gathering on the roof. Occasional shifts as accumulated weight redistributes itself. It is not loud, but it is constant enough to feel like it has replaced silence entirely. The lamp flickers once, reacting to a faint draft you cannot quite locate. You glance around the room, noticing how even the interior air seems to be participating in the storm's pressure system. The cabin is not leaking warmth, but it is negotiating boundaries. You stand again and walk toward the window. The snow is thicker now, falling in a way that no longer allows distance to remain visible. The forest is almost gone, not destroyed, just obscured, like a memory being covered rather than erased. A widely documented feature of frontier settlement life in snowy regions is how quickly visibility could collapse during sustained storms, especially when wind combined with heavy precipitation. Travellers and homesteaders often describe conditions where orientation depended more on instinct and memory than sight. That lived experience is well recorded in expedition logs and military reports from the period, which describe whiteout conditions as disorienting even for experienced guides. You understand why now the world outside your window is no longer a landscape, it is a motion without edging. The wind shifts again, and this time the cabin responds with a deeper, longer creak that travels from one side of the structure to the other. You place a hand on the wall without thinking. The wood feels solid, but alive in its own way, expanding and contracting as temperature and pressure negotiate continuously. A small quirky detail from frontier oral tradition comes to mind. Some homesteaders reportedly claim they could tell the severity of a storm by how their cabin nails sounded as wood expanded. Iron nails were said to sing under pressure changes, producing faint, high-pitched sounds when temperatures dropped rapidly. Modern acoustical analysis suggests this may have been partially influenced by environmental noise rather than the nails themselves. But the belief appears frequently enough in folk accounts to suggest it held cultural significance beyond simple observation. You return to your seat near the stove. The heat feels steadier now, as if the fire has fully accepted its role for the night. Your hands begin to regain a normal colour, and the stiffness from outdoor work slowly fades into background sensation. Outside, the snow continues to build, not in sudden bursts, but in accumulation that feels inevitable. The landscape is disappearing layer by layer, not erased, but rewritten into uniformity. You find yourself watching it longer than intended, as if expecting it to change pattern or reveal something beneath itself. The cabin remains your only stable reference point. Everything else is becoming variable. There is a quiet moment where the storm seems to pause its escalation, not stopping, just holding its current intensity, like it is evaluating whether to continue building or maintain its current state. In that brief interval, you become aware of your own breathing again, and the small sounds inside the cabin reassert themselves. You notice the stove ticking softly as metal expands. You hear a faint shift of straw in the mattress. You hear your own movement when you adjust your posture. Inside, everything is precise in a way the outside world no longer is. Then the wind returns with slightly more confidence, pressing against the cabin in a longer continuous wave. Now strikes the walls with a steadier rhythm. The sound is not aggressive, but persistent, like a conversation that refuses to end. You sit back, letting your body settle into stillness. The cabin holds, the storm continues, and between them, you remain in a small pocket of warmth that feels increasingly separate from the world beyond the logs, as if the boundary between inside and outside is no longer just physical, but perceptual. The storm outside has settled into a steady rhythm now, the kind that stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a condition. You remain near the stove, watching the fire shift and pulse in small, patient movements. The cabin is warmer than it was earlier, but the warmth is uneven, pooling in some places while retreating from others, like it has its own geography. You notice how your awareness of space inside the cabin has changed. Earlier it felt like a simple shelter. Now it feels more layered, as if every corner holds a slightly different version of the same night. The bed, the table, the stove, each one anchored in its own small climate of heat and shadow. Outside, the snow continues to fall in thickening curtains. The window no longer shows a forest. It shows movement, white against darker white, shifting without clear direction. Visibility has dropped to the point where distance is no longer measurable in a meaningful way. This is a condition frequently documented in frontier travel logs, especially during winter crossings where sudden storms could erase landmarks entirely within hours. You lean forward slightly, resting your elbows on your knees. The fire crackles again, a small burst of sound that feels exaggerated in the enclosed space. The cabin responds with a faint groan, timber adjusting to pressure and temperature changes. It is not threatening, just constant. like a living thing adjusting its posture in sleep. A mainstream historical understanding of frontier winter life emphasizes how isolation intensified during storms like this. Settlements could become temporarily cut off, not only physically but socially. As communication routes disappeared under snow, that reality is well supported by postal records and settler diaries. Though some historians emphasize that the emotional accounts may vary depending on literacy, memory, and personal resilience, you stand and walk slowly towards the window again. The glass is now heavily fogged at the edges, with only a narrow central area still offering partial visibility through it. The world outside appears almost abstract. The trees are no longer distinct forms, they are vertical shadows submerged in motion. You place a hand lightly against the glass. It is cold enough to pull warmth from your skin almost immediately. The contrast reminds you how thin the separation between inside and outside truly is, even if the mind treats it as absolute. A small frontier observation comes to mind. Some settlers believed that storms of this intensity carried a kind of settling silence at their core, where sound seemed to flatten rather than disappear. This idea appears in multiple handwritten accounts from homesteads across northern regions, though whether it reflects acoustic conditions or psychological adaptation remains uncertain. You step back from the window and return to the stove. The fire has shifted slightly, logs settling into new positions. You adjust one with a careful movement, and the flame responds immediately, brightening for a moment before stabilizing again. It feels almost responsive, like a system that rewards attention. You become aware of how time feels different inside the cabin. Without external reference points, the passage of minutes becomes fluid. The storm removes landmarks not only outside but also inside perception. This phenomenon has been noted in environmental psychology studies examining isolation conditions. Though the frontier experience predates any formal academic framing of it, you sit down again on the edge of the bed. The straw mattress shifts beneath you with a soft, dry rustle. The sound is subtle, but it feels amplified in the quiet. You notice how many small noises exist inside the cabin that would normally be ignored in everyday life. The ticking expansion of wood, the faint hiss of snow against logs, the occasional sheet of air through unseen gaps. Outside, the wind changes direction slightly. You can tell not by sight but by how the cabin reacts. One side of the structure creaks more than the others, like pressure is redistributing itself across the frame. This indirect awareness of weather through structural response is something many frontier settlers described in their accounts, often noting how buildings became instruments for interpreting storms. There is a quirky detail preserved in some oral traditions from the period. Certain homesteaders reportedly kept small bowls of water inside during storms to observe vibration patterns on the surface, believing it could indicate wind strength changes outside. While this practice lacks scientific grounding, it appears frequently enough in folklore collections to suggest it held symbolic or observational value within isolated communities. You glance at the table again. The tin cup sits where it was earlier, unchanged but oddly present in a more noticeable way now. Objects seem more defined in the absence of external distraction. Even simple items gain presence when the outside world reduces itself to uniform motion. The storm continues its steady progression. Snow accumulation increases beyond the window's limited view, though you can only infer it rather than observe it directly. The sense of enclosure deepens, not in a claustrophobic way, but in a way that feels increasingly complete, as if the cabin and storm are negotiating boundaries that slowly blur. You move to the stove once more and add a small piece of wood. The flame responds with a brief rise, casting shifting light across the walls. Shadows move in slow arcs, reacting to fire rather than wind. For a moment, the interior feels almost theatrical, like a stage defined entirely by heat and darkness. A widely recognized aspect of frontier architecture was the prioritization of centralized heat sources for exactly this reason. The stove or hearth was not only functional but spatially defining, determining where people gathered and how rooms were used. That understanding is well supported by archaeological evidence from homestead sites. Though interpretations differ on how much emotional significance settlers attach to these arrangements beyond practicality, you return to your seat again, letting the rhythm of the fire settle into your awareness. The storm outside has not intensified further, but it has not diminished either. It has stabilized into endurance. There is a moment where you simply listen, not actively, not searching for meaning, but allowing sound to exist without interpretation. Wind, wood, fire, snow, all layered together into a continuous background presence. You notice your breathing aligning with it slightly, not matching exactly, but influenced by it. This is often described in accounts of prolonged isolation, where environmental rhythm begins to affect bodily perception. Whether that is physiological adaptation or subjective impression is still discussed among researchers who study sensory environments, though no single explanation fully captures their experience. The cabin holds steady, the storm holds steady, and between them, you exist in a narrow band of warmth and containment that feels increasingly separate from anything beyond the logs. Outside, the world continues to disappear into uniform white motion. Inside, the fire continues to insist on difference. And for now, that contrast is enough to define everything you need to know about where you are, and how small the boundary really is between shelter and wilderness. You become aware of the forest before you ever see it, the way it announces itself through sound rather than sight. The cabin holds steady, but it is no longer separate from what is happening outside. It feels more like a shell with hearing than a barrier with silence. Every gust of wind now carries texture, and every shift in temperature seems to translate into noise along the walls. At first it is subtle, a low, continuous pressure in the trees. Then the sharper sounds begin to emerge, branches brushing against each other under the weight of accumulating snow. Occasionally, there is a deeper crack, the kind that suggests something giving way under strain, though not necessarily breaking completely. The forest is active in a way that does not require visibility. You sit still near the stove, listening. The fire has settled into a steady rhythm, but even that feels quieter now, as if the outside world is negotiating for dominance in the soundscape. The cabin does not leak warmth so much as it filters it, and in the same way it filters sound, turning the wilderness into something partially translates. Outside, wind moves through the tree line in uneven waves. It does not travel in a straight line. It bends, swirls, and returns, like it is testing different paths through resistance. The result is a layered noise, never quite repeating, never fully predictable. You notice how your attention sharpens without effort. This is something many frontier accounts describe in winter isolation, where hearing becomes the primary sense for interpreting the environment. It is well established in environmental history studies that cold air carries sound more efficiently than warm air, allowing distant noises to travel more echo and with greater clarity. That physical reality changes perception, making the forest feel closer than it actually is. A sudden sound cuts through the wind, not loud but distinct. A long, drawn note that rises and then fades unevenly. You pause, listening more carefully. It could be wind passing through a hollowed trunk. It could also be something moving across snow. The uncertainty is part of the experience. The cabin responds to the sound with a faint creak, as if acknowledging it. You realize that you are no longer just listening outward. You are also listening inward, to the structure itself. Timber expands and contracts with temperature shifts, producing its own language of small noises. The walls speak in slower tones than the forest, but they speak constantly. A little-known detail from frontier oral tradition mentions how settlers sometimes used hanging objects inside cabins to interpret wind strength. Suspended kettle or metal tool could produce faint vibrations or intermittent ringing when external gusts reached certain intensities. Whether this practice was deliberate or simply noticed after the fact is unclear, but it appears often enough in personal accounts to suggest it became part of how people read their environment. Outside, the wind strengthens again and the forest answers with more complex sound. There is no single direction now. Everything feels layered. The trees are no longer individual entities in your perception, but a collective surface responding to pressure. Snow falling through branches creates a soft, continuous hush beneath the sharper creaks. You shift slightly in your seat, and the floorboard beneath you responds with a dull groan. Even small movements feel amplified in this environment. The cabin is not silent, but its sounds are contained, predictable compared to the wilderness outside. A second auditory shift emerges from the forest, lower in tone. It could be wind compressing through denser tree clusters, or it could be something moving steadily through snow-covered ground. In many frontier narratives, animals are often interpreted through sound alone during storms. Wolves, coyotes, or even deer become acoustic impressions rather than visible presences. It is widely accepted in wildlife studies that wolf packs in cold regions become more vocal during winter, their howls carrying farther due to atmospheric conditions. That biological reality is well documented. Though the way settlers interpreted those sounds varied significantly, depending on cultural background and personal experience. You listen again, the sound does not repeat. It leaves only uncertainty behind. The fire pops suddenly in the stove, a small burst that briefly interrupts your focus. Light flickers across the walls, making the logs appear to shift for a moment before settling back into stillness. Shadows stretch and retract in slow motion. Outside, the storm continues to evolve. Snow now moves not just downward but sideways in places, driven by shifting wind currents, wind. The result is a soundscape that feels layered in depth, as if the forest has multiple voices speaking at once. There is a moment where you notice how your mind begins to assign meaning to each sound automatically. This is something cognitive researchers studying isolation environments often highlight. The human tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli as structured patterns when external reference points are limited. In frontier conditions, that tendency would have been heightened by survival necessity. Another sound rises from the forest edge. This one is shorter, sharper, and then gone. You do not move, but your attention locks onto it. It does not return, which somehow makes it more noticeable in memory than if it had continued. You glance toward the window again. The glass is now almost completely opaque with condensation and frost forming along the edges. Only a faint central patch remains clear enough to show motion outside, and even that is increasingly abstract. The cabin feels warmer now, but not because the fire has grown stronger. It is because your perception of contrast has intensified. Inside and outside are becoming more distinct in your awareness, even as physical boundaries remain unchanged. A quiet detail from frontier life comes to mind. Some homesteaders reportedly claimed that during heavy storms, they could identify individual animals by the rhythm of their movement through snow, even when visibility was zero. Tracks, pauses, and pacing patterns became auditory signatures. Whether this level of perception was common skill or occasional exaggeration in personal storytelling is still open to interpretation, depending on which historical accounts are given more weight. You adjust your posture again, listening not just to the forest but to the way sound shifts over time. The storm is not escalating in a single direction. It is fluctuating, expanding in some moments, compressing in others. This variability makes it harder to form a stable sense of what is happening beyond the cabin. Inside, the stove continues its steady cycle. Heat rises, cool air replaces it with it. Wood shifts slightly as it burns. The sound is consistent enough to anchor you. outside. A longer sound emerges, low, continuous, and moving. It travels across what you assume is open ground. Though assumption feels unreliable in this visibility, it could be wind through snowdrifts, it could be an animal moving parallel to the cabin, it could be something entirely unrelated to either interpretation. You do not attempt to resolve it, you simply listen. The forest, in this state, becomes less about identification and more about presence. Each sound is a fragment of a larger system you cannot fully reconstruct. The cabin remains your only fixed reference point, and even that feels increasingly like an island within motion. At one point, the wind drops briefly, esto. The sudden reduction in noise is almost disorienting. Silence does not return. Instead, it is replaced by quieter details you had not been aware of before. The subtle settling of wood, the faint hiss of cooling air near the window edges, your own breathing. Then the wind returns, and with it the layered forest soundscape resumes, as if it had never paused at all. You remain seated, letting the rhythm of it pass through you without interpretation. The forest continues its invisible movement outside the logs, and the cabin continues its steady containment within them. Between those two states, you simply listen as the night deepens without needing to announce itself further. The stove settles into a steady pulse of heat now, no longer needing attention every few minutes. You sit nearby, letting your hands hover in and out of its warmth, noticing how quickly the cold still tries to reclaim them the moment you pull away. The cabin feels smaller tonight, not physically, but in the way attention compresses space when the outside world becomes more active than the inside one. Outside, the storm has shifted again. It is no longer just snow and wind. It has become layers of movement that overlap and cancel each other in unpredictable ways. At times, the sound rises sharply, then falls into near silence, then rises again with a different texture. You begin to notice that nothing outside stays consistent for long enough to fully interpret. You stand and walk slowly towards the table. The wood beneath your boots creaks in a familiar rhythm now, as if the cabin has adjusted to your presence and stopped reacting with surprise. On the table, the tin cup catches a faint reflection of firelight, a small circle of movement that shifts whenever the flame inside the stove changes intensity. A mainstream historical understanding of frontier winters notes how households in isolated cabins often developed heightened sensitivity to environmental change. This was not just observation but necessity. People depended on subtle cues in sound, temperature, and smell to make decisions about survival. That understanding is supported by numerous settler diaries and expedition journals, though interpretations vary depending on region and climate severity. You glance toward the window again. Frost has thickened along the edges, creating intricate patterns that spread inward like slow-moving branches. The centre is still partially visible, but it now feels like looking through multiple layers of obstruction rather than a single pane of glass. The forest beyond is almost entirely erased. What remains is motion without shape. Occasionally, something darker passes through the white, but it is impossible to determine scale or distance. It could be a tree, or snow drifting in dense clusters, or something moving between both. You return to the stove and add another small piece of wood. The flame responds with a brief rise, then settles again into its controlled burn. The sound it makes is subtle but constant, a combination of soft crackles and the occasional sharper pop as trapped sap expands and releases. The heat spreads unevenly across the room, creating invisible zones of comfort and coolness. There is a lesser-known frontier detail that appears in several personal accounts from the era. Some settlers believe that fire behaved differently in enclosed log cabins, depending on how tightly the structure was sealed against wind. They described flames that leaned slightly toward invisible drafts or shifted their burn pattern during storms. While modern understanding attributes this to airflow variations, the observation itself was recorded frequently enough to suggest it was widely noticed. even if not fully understood. You sit back down and let your attention drift again to the sounds outside. The wind has developed a more structured pattern now. It is not random, it moves in cycles, building and releasing pressure in intervals that feel almost intentional. Each cycle brings a different arrangement of noise across the forest. A distant sound emerges. Longer this time, it travels slowly across the landscape, fading in and out depending on wind direction. You do not try to identify it immediately. Instead, you allow it to exist as sound first, meaning second. In environmental history, research focused on frontier regions. There is recognition that sound played a crucial role in spatial awareness during winter isolation. When visibility dropped, auditory cues became primary indicators of environmental change. This is well supported by both scientific analysis of sound propagation in cold air and historical documentation from travelers who relied heavily on listening to navigate storms. You tilt your head slightly, focusing again. The sound outside has changed character. It is less about individual events now and more about continuous motion. The forest feels like it is breathing in long cycles, expanding and contracting under pressure. You notice your own breathing aligning unconsciously with the rhythm of the storm, not matching it exactly, but influenced by it in subtle ways. This kind of sensory entrainment has been observed in isolation studies. Though the frontier experience predates any formal research into it, a small frontier anecdote comes to mind. Some homesteaders reportedly claim they could distinguish between different types of snowfall by sound alone. Powder snow was said to produce a softer hush, while heavier wet snow created a more muted, dragging sound as it accumulated on surfaces. Whether these distinctions were consistently perceptible or partially shaped by memory and storytelling is uncertain, but they appear repeatedly in oral histories collected from later generations. Outside, the wind increases briefly, and the cabin responds with a deeper groan. You place a hand against the wall instinctively. The logs feel solid, but alive in their own slow way. They expand and contract in response to temperature shifts, producing faint internal sounds that travel through the structure like whispers. You move away from the wall and back toward the center of the room. The stove remains the most stable point of reference. Everything else feels slightly variable, even though nothing has physically changed. It is perception that is shifting, not structure. The window now shows almost no detail at all. Only a faint gradient of movement suggests where the outside world begins. Snow continues to accumulate, though you can no longer see its individual motion. Instead, it appears as a uniform field of brightness and shadow. Another sound emerges from outside, sharper and more localized. It appears briefly, then disappears completely. You pause, listening for repetition, but it does not return in the same form. The absence of recurrence makes it more noticeable in memory than in the moment itself. You sit again, letting your body settle into the rhythm of the cabin. The straw in the mattress shifts slightly as you lean back, producing a soft rustling sound. Even these small internal noises feel more pronounced now, as if the cabin has reduced all external input to emphasize what remains inside. A widely documented feature of frontier architecture was how sound behaved differently in log structures compared to more modern buildings. The irregular surfaces of logs, combined with natural insulation materials like moss or clay, created unique acoustic properties. Sounds were absorbed unevenly, making certain frequencies more noticeable while dampening others. This is supported by both physical reconstruction studies and analysis of surviving historical structures. You notice this now in a lived way rather than an academic one. The cabin does not silence the world, it filters it into something less defined, more interpretive, outside. The storm reaches a temporary plateau, not calm but stable in intensity. The sound becomes less varied, more uniform. It feels like the system has reached a temporary equilibrium before changing again. You sit quietly, letting that uniform sound fill the space between thoughts. There is no urgency in it, only persistence. The cabin remains warm enough to hold you, and the storm remains distant enough not to break that hold. For a moment, everything feels suspended in a narrow balance. Inside, steady heat. Outside, steady motion. And between them, your awareness resting somewhere in the middle. Listening without needing to define what comes next. The cabin settles into a quieter rhythm now. Though it is not truly quieter in the absence of sound, it's quieter in the way attention adjusts when repetition replaces novelty. The storm outside continues, but it no longer announces itself in distinct changes. Instead, it becomes a continuous presence, like a distant body of water frozen in motion. You sit near the stove, letting the heat build and fade across your hands in slow cycles. The fire has reached a stable stage, where it no longer demands constant tending. Each log burns at its own pace, producing a steady glow that softens the edges of the room. Shadows move gently across the walls, not in response to sudden shifts, but to gradual changes in flame intensity. Your eyes drift toward the table again. The tin cup remains in place, unchanged but increasingly noticeable simply because nothing else competes with it for attention. The cabin has reduced itself to a small collection of objects and sounds, each one amplified by isolation. Outside, the snow continues to accumulate in layers that cannot be measured directly anymore. Visibility has collapsed into abstraction. What you see through the window is no longer a landscape but a shifting gradient of light and motion. The tree line, once a reference point, has been fully absorbed into the storm. A widely accepted understanding among historians of frontier settlement emphasizes how winter storms like this one reshaped daily perception. When external landmarks disappeared, people relied heavily on memory and internal mapping to maintain orientation. That reliance is well documented in expedition journals and homesteader accounts, though interpretations vary depending on how isolated each community was from supply routes and neighbouring settlements. You stand and stretch slightly, feeling the stiffness in your joints from remaining still for too long. The floor creaks under your movements as the sound feels unusually sharp in the enclosed space. You notice how quickly your awareness of small sounds has increased since the storm intensified. You walk toward the window again. Frost patterns have thickened further, forming layered structures that resemble branching networks. Only a small portion remains partially transparent, and even that section is now filled with indistinct motion. The outside world is no longer something you observe directly, it is something you infer. A lesser-known detail from frontier oral accounts describes how settlers sometimes used sound echoes inside cabins to estimate storm intensity. They would clap once or tap wooden surfaces and listen to how the sound returned or was absorbed by the structure. While not a standardized practice, it appears often enough in personal recollections to suggest it was a form of improvised environmental sensing rather than superstition alone. You do not test this yourself, instead you simply listen. The wind outside shifts again, and the cabin responds with a slow, elongated creak that travels along the beams overhead. The sound is not alarming, but it is deeply present. It reminds you that the structure is constantly negotiating with external pressure, adjusting in small increments to remain intact. You return to the stove and adjust one of the logs. The flame briefly brightens, then settles into a lower, steadier burn. Heat radiates outward in uneven waves, creating invisible zones of warmth and coolness across the room. You find yourself unconsciously repositioning slightly to remain within the warmer area. In environmental studies of historical isolation, it is often noted that humans in confined winter shelters develop heightened spatial awareness of heat distribution. This is not only physical but cognitive. As attention begins to map thermal zones within enclosed spaces, that phenomenon is supported by modern sensory research. though it was long observed anecdotally in earlier survival narratives. You sit again, letting your attention drift outward toward the storm. The sound outside has changed character once more. It is less segmented now, more unified. The wind no longer arrives in distinct gusts. Instead, it flows continuously, shaping the snow into a moving surface that presses against the world. There is a brief moment where the sound seems to recede, not fully stop, but thin out. In that interval, the cabin becomes more audible again. You hear the stove ticking softly, the faint shift of wood as it cools and expands, your own breathing becoming more noticeable. Then the wind returns, filling the space once more with layered motion. A small frontier observation preserved in regional storytelling traditions describes how storms were sometimes perceived as having depth, not in a visual sense, but in auditory layering. People spoke of being able to hear near wind, mid-wind, and far wind simultaneously, as if the storm existed in multiple distances at once. Whether this reflects actual acoustic layering or psychological interpretation is still an open question among researchers who study historical environmental perception. You tilt your head slightly, listening for those layers now. There is indeed a sense of separation within the sound. Some movements feel closer, brushing against the cabin directly. Others feel distant, like echoes travelling through open land. And beneath it all is a steady base of continuous motion that never fully resolves into silence. The cabin remains steady. It does not resist the storm so much as accommodate it. Each log in its structure carries part of the load, distributing pressure evenly enough to maintain stability. You can feel this indirectly through the subtle vibrations that pass through the floor and walls. You stand once more and walk slowly toward the bed. The straw inside shifts softly as you sit on the edge. The sound is small but distinct, adding another layer to the interior environment. You notice how the cabin has become a collection of controlled noises, each one predictable compared to the outside. A widely documented aspect of frontier life is the way settlers often describe their homes as speaking during storms. This was not literal belief, but a way of interpreting structural responses to wind and temperature changes. That metaphor appears frequently in diaries and letters from the period, suggesting a shared cultural language for describing environmental interaction with buildings. You lean back slightly, letting your posture relax. The fire continues its steady cycle. The storm continues its broader motion. And between them, you remain in a space defined not by stillness, but by controlled continuity. Outside, the snow continues to fall without variation. Inside, time continues to feel slightly detached from external reference points. The cabin holds its shape, the storm holds its rhythm, and your awareness moves gently between them, anchored by heat and sound, without needing to resolve either into something final. The fire has settled into a deep, steady burn now, the kind that no longer demands attention but quietly insists on being respected. You sit close enough to feel its warmth across your face, yet far enough to notice the edges of cold still lingering in the room. The cabin feels like it has divided itself into invisible zones, each shaped by heat, shadow, and the slow pressure of the storm outside. You let your gaze drift across the interior again. Nothing has changed, yet everything feels slightly more defined. The table looks heavier in the dim light. The bed seems more narrow than it did earlier. Even the stove feels more central, as if it has grown into its role as the heart of the space. This shift in perception is subtle but persistent, the kind that comes from extended isolation in enclosed environments. Outside, the storm continues its slow accumulation. Snow presses against the world in layers rather than bursts now. The window shows almost no detail at all, only shifting brightness and occasional darker movements that might be trees or might simply be the wind rearranging snowfall patterns. The distinction no longer feels important enough to resolve. You stand and move toward the table again. Your boots sound different on the floor now, not louder, but more familiar. The cabin has stopped reacting to your presence as something new. It has accepted your rhythm. You place a hand on the tabletop and feel the slight unevenness of its surface, worn by use and time. A widely documented feature of mid-19th century frontier life was how interiors like this one often became multifunctional spaces. Cooking, sleeping, repairing tools, and storing supplies all happened in a single room. That arrangement was not simply a matter of simplicity, but necessity shaped by limited resources and harsh seasonal conditions. Many surviving homestead records support this. Though the emotional implications of living in such compressed environments are interpreted differently depending on the source material, you glance toward the corner where the stove continues its quiet work. The metal surface emits a low, constant heat that radiates outward in uneven patterns. You notice how your body naturally orients toward it without conscious thought. Warmth becomes a kind of gravity in this space. Outside, the wind shifts again. It does not announce itself with sudden force, but rather changes direction gradually, and the cabin responds in layers. One wall creaks slightly more than the others. A faint vibration passes through the beams above you. The structure is not unstable, but it is active, constantly adjusting to external pressure. You return to the bed and sit. The straw inside compresses softly, producing a sound that feels almost private in the larger noise of the storm. You notice how sound inside the cabin has become easier to distinguish individually, as if each noise now carries more weight simply because there are fewer competing references. A lesser-known detail from frontier oral traditions describes how some settlers claim they could identify storm intensity by the way snow accumulated on different sides of their cabins. Windward walls would harden quickly under compacted snow, while sheltered sides formed softer drifts that shifted with minor gusts. Whether this observation was consistently reliable is uncertain, but it appears frequently enough in personal accounts to suggest it became part of how people read their immediate environment. You listen again. The storm outside has developed a more consistent tone, less varied than before. It is no longer a collection of separate sounds, but a continuous layer of motion. The effect is strangely stabilizing, even though it represents increasing severity outside. You lean forward slightly, resting your elbows on your knees. The firelight flickers across the floorboards, revealing subtle imperfections in the wood grain. Small knots, faint scratches, and uneven seams become more visible under shifting light. The cabin feels increasingly like a record of its own construction. Outside, visibility has collapsed completely. There is no longer any sense of distance through the window, only motion and density. The glass has become a barrier, not just physically, but perceptually. It no longer frames the outside world, it separates it entirely. You stand again and walk slowly towards the stove. The heat has stabilized at a comfortable intensity, and you find yourself adjusting your position relative to it almost instinctively. This behavior mirrors patterns observed in historical accounts of isolated winter living, where individuals often structured their movement around heat sources more than furniture layouts. A small frontier observation passed down in regional storytelling describes how some homesteaders believed that prolonged storms created a kind of listening fatigue, where continuous exposure to wind and structural noise made quieter sounds inside the cabin feel exaggerated. While not scientifically defined at the time, this perception aligns with modern understandings of sensory adaptation in sustained environments. You pause near the stove and let your hand hover above it. The warmth rises steadily. Not aggressive, but constant. You notice how the sensation changes depending on distance, creating a gradient of heat that you move through without thinking. The wind outside intensifies briefly, and the cabin responds with a deeper, more unified creak. It is not alarming, it is structural communication. The logs settle into new positions under shifting pressure, redistributing force across joints and corners. You return to your seat again. The repetition of movement inside the cabin has become almost ritualistic. Sit, stand, adjust, listen. Each action produces predictable results within the space, reinforcing a sense of internal order that contrasts with the external unpredictability. There is a moment where the storm outside seems to pause in variation again, not a decrease in intensity, but a leveling of behavior. Snow continues to fall, wind continues to move, but the changes between moments become less pronounced. Inside the cabin, this creates a strange sensation of suspension. Time feels less segmented. The fire continues its cycle. The stove continues its expansion and contraction. Your breathing remains steady. Everything operates within a narrow band of consistency. You glance once more at the table. The tin cup catches a faint reflection of firelight again, but even that reflection feels subdued now, as if the light itself has softened. The room is not darker, it is simply more uniform. Outside, a faint shift in sound occurs. The wind drops slightly, and for a brief moment, the storm's texture changes. Instead of layered motion, there is a smoother flow, as if the system has reorganized itself. Then it returns to its previous rhythm. You do not react immediately. You simply register it. The cabin remains warm, enclosed, and stable. The storm remains active, continuous, and unseen. Between them, you sit in a space defined less by contrast now and more by coexistence, where neither inside nor outside fully dominates perception. And in that steady balance, the night continues without urgency, unfolding in slow, uninterrupted motion. The storm outside has settled into something that feels less like change and more like endurance. You notice it not through dramatic shifts, but through sustained presence. The wind no longer arrives in distinct waves. It becomes a continuous pressure that seems to occupy the entire landscape at once, as if the night itself has thickened. You remain seated near the stove, watching the fire's steady movement. The flames are lower now, but still strong enough to hold the cabin together in warmth. Light moves across the room in slow cycles, revealing and concealing the same familiar objects without introducing anything new. The table, the bed, the walls, all feel like they belong to a closed system that has stopped expecting outside input. A sense of temporal drift begins to emerge. It is subtle at first. You find yourself less certain about how long you have been sitting in one place. The absence of external markers makes time feel less segmented. This effect is frequently noted in historical accounts of winter isolation in frontier settlements, where storms could erase not only visibility but also reliable cues for tracking hours or even parts of the day. You shift your posture slightly, feeling the straw in the mattress respond with a soft, dry sound. Even this small noise feels more pronounced than it would in ordinary conditions. The cabin has not become quieter, but your awareness of its sounds has sharpened. Everything is more noticeable simply because there is less competition for attention. Outside, the snow continues to accumulate without variation. The window shows only a dense, shifting brightness like a surface rather than a view. Any sense of depth has disappeared entirely. The forest is no longer something you can locate. It exists only as an assumption. You stand and walk slowly towards the stove. The floor creaks beneath your boots in a familiar rhythm now. You have learned its language without trying. The stove's heat radiates outward in a stable gradient, strongest near its core and fading gradually into the corners of the room. You hold your hands closer to it for a moment. The warmth is immediate but uneven, as if the air itself is layered in temperature. This layering effect is something often mentioned in environmental studies of enclosed winter shelters, where heat distribution rarely remains uniform due to structural design and airflow limitations. Those observations align with what that you feel now, though here it is not an abstract principle but a lived condition. A small frontier, Bayer, Observation Preserved in Regional Storytelling, describes how settlers sometimes mark the passage of long storms by observing changes in fire behaviour. Flames that burned steadily were taken as signs of stable weather conditions outside, while flickering or uneven burning was associated with shifting winds or pressure changes. While this interpretation lacks scientific grounding, it appears frequently in oral traditions, suggesting it served as a practical emotional framework for interpreting environmental uncertainty. You return to your seat and let your attention drift again toward the window. The frost patterns have become denser, forming overlapping structures that obscure nearly all visibility. Only faint movement remains, and even that is ambiguous enough to resist interpretation. The outside world has effectively withdrawn from direct perception. Inside the cabin, however, everything remains consistent. The stove ticks softly as metal expands and contracts with heat. The fire emits a steady, controlled sound. Your breathing becomes part of this internal rhythm without conscious effort. The space feels self-contained in a way that is both stable and slightly isolating. A widely documented aspect of frontier winter living involves how households often developed heightened awareness of structural sound during storms. Log shifting, joints tightening, and small expansions in wood became familiar indicators of environmental pressure. These sounds were not considered alarming but informative, forming part of how people understood their immediate surroundings. You notice those sounds now more clearly than before. A faint creak travels along one beam overhead. Another follows along the opposite wall. These are not random noises, but responses to continuous external force. The cabin is not resisting the storm in a static way. It is adjusting to it constantly. You lean back slightly and close your eyes for a moment. Without visual input, the soundscape becomes more defined. The stove's low burn, the wind's continuous pressure, the subtle shifting of wood as temperature changes. Each layer becomes easier to distinguish when sight is removed from the equation. Outside, the storm continues its uniform motion. There is no escalation, no decline, only persistence. That persistence begins to feel like its own form of structure, a stable condition rather than an active event. You open your eyes again and look toward the table. The tin cup is still there, unchanged. Its presence feels almost symbolic now, not because it has gained meaning, but because it has remained unchanged while everything else has become fluid. You stand and stretch your arms slowly, feeling stiffness from prolonged stillness. The cabin responds with a faint series of creaks that travel through the floor and walls. You've come to recognize these responses as part of the building's internal dialogue with the storm. A lesser-known detail from frontier accounts describes how some settlers believed that prolonged exposure to winter storms could alter one's perception of sound spacing, making pauses between noises feel longer than they actually were. Whether this reflects actual cognitive adaptation or simply heightened attention under isolation remains uncertain, but it appears in enough personal writings to suggest it was a commonly experienced sensation. You move back toward the stove again, more out of habit than necessity. The heat remains steady. The fire continues its controlled cycle. You notice how your movements inside the cabin have become increasingly economical. Each action guided by familiarity rather than decision. Outside, the snow continues its accumulation without visible interruption. The window offers no return of detail. The forest remains absent in perception, though not in assumption. You know it is there, but knowing and seeing have become entirely separate experiences. The wind shifts slightly, and the cabin responds with a slow, unified sound that travels across its frame. It's not louder than before, but more coordinated. The structure reacts as a single system rather than individual parts. You sit again and let your hands rest loosely in your lap. The firelight moves across the room in gentle arcs, revealing and concealing the same familiar shapes. Nothing new enters the space, nothing leaves it. time continues to lose definition. You do not feel it passing so much as you feel it continuing. The difference is subtle but noticeable when you stop trying to measure it. The storm outside remains constant. The cabin remains steady, and between them, you exist in a space where observation replaces change, and continuity replaces sequence. The night does not advance in clear steps anymore. It simply persists, evenly and without interruption. The cabin holds its steady warmth, but something about the atmosphere has shifted in a way that is difficult to define. Not colder, not louder, not darker, but more continuous. The storm outside has settled into a presence that no longer feels like movement across a landscape. It feels like the landscape itself is now in motion. You sit quietly near the stove, watching the fire as it continues its slow, deliberate cycle. The flames are smaller now, yet still persistent, casting soft light that moves in predictable arcs across the walls. The wood inside the stove shifts occasionally with soft pops, each one brief enough to be almost absorbed by the surrounding soundscape. Your awareness drifts toward the window again. The frost has advanced further inward, forming dense overlapping patterns that obscure nearly all remaining transparency. What little remains of visibility is now abstract, a shifting gradient of brightness and shadow with no stable reference points. The forest, the field, the horizon, all of it has been absorbed into the storm's uniform presence. A widely recognized aspect of frontier winter life involves how visual information became unreliable during prolonged storms, forcing people to depend more heavily on sound, memory, and structural cues for orientation. This shift in sensory reliance is well supported by both environmental analysis and historical accounts from isolated homesteads, though interpretations of how individuals adapted psychologically vary across regions and conditions. You stand slowly and walk towards the table. The floor creaks beneath your boots in a familiar rhythm. The sound no longer feels like an interruption. It feels like part of the cabin's baseline state. You place your hand on the tabletop again, noticing its slight unevenness, its worn texture shaped by repeated use over time. The tin cup remains where it was before, unchanged. Its stillness feels more pronounced now, not because it is new, but because everything else feels increasingly fluid in comparison. The cabin has begun to reduce itself into a set of stable reference points, each one gaining significance through contrast with the shifting environment outside. You move toward the stove and adjust a log. The flame responds with a brief rise, then settles back into its steady burn. Heat radiates outward in a controlled gradient, strongest near the source and gradually diminishing toward the edges of the room. You find yourself unconsciously repositioning to remain within the most comfortable zones, a behavior frequently observed in historical accounts of isolated winter living, where individuals organized movement around heat distribution rather than furniture placement. A small frontier observation preserved in regional storytelling describes how settlers sometimes used the sound of cracking ice on nearby wood or water sources to estimate temperature drops during storms. While not scientifically precise, these observations formed part of a broader pattern of environmental interpretation based on indirect sensory input. Such practices highlight the adaptive ways people learn to read their surroundings in the absence of formal measurement tools. You return to your seat and let your attention drift again toward the window. The storm has reached a level of uniformity that makes it difficult to distinguish individual events. Snow, wind, and motion blend into a single continuous texture. It is no longer something you watch, it is something you infer. The cabin's interior sounds become more noticeable as external variation decreases. The stove ticks softly as metal adjusts to heat changes. The beams overhead emit faint structural sounds as pressure shifts across the frame. Even your own breathing feels more distinct, as if the reduction of external noise has amplified internal awareness. You close your eyes briefly, without visual input. The soundscape becomes more layered. The storm is still present, but it is filtered through the cabin, in a way that separates it into multiple channels. Distant pressure, mid-range wind movement, close contact snow against wood. These layers create a sense of depth that is no longer tied to sight. A lesser-known detail from frontier oral accounts describes how some settlers believed storms had phases that could be identified purely through sound progression. They would describe transitions from sharp intermittent gusts to continuous pressure as indicators of storm maturity. While modern meteorological understanding explains these shifts in terms of atmospheric dynamics, the experiential descriptions remain consistent across many personal writings from the period. You open your eyes again. The cabin remains unchanged. The stove continues its steady burn. The table, bed, and walls maintain their positions without variation, yet the sense of time remains fluid. Difficult to measure or segment, it passes without clear markers. Outside, the storm continues its sustained motion. There is no indication of weakening or strengthening, only persistence. That persistence begins to feel less like an event and more like a condition that has replaced the normal structure of night. You stand and walk slowly towards the bed. The straw mattress shifts slightly under your weight as you sit. The sound is soft but distinct, adding another layer to the internal acoustic environment of the cabin. You notice how even small movements produce noticeable feedback in this enclosed space. A widely documented feature of frontier architecture involves how log structures created unique acoustic environments due to irregular surfaces and natural insulation materials. Sound was absorbed unevenly, resulting in selective amplification of certain frequencies. This made interior spaces feel both muted and sharply detailed at the same time, depending on the type of sound being produced. You lean back slightly, allowing your posture to relax. The fire continues its steady rhythm. The storm continues its uniform motion. Between them, the cabin holds a narrow zone of stability that feels increasingly self-contained. Outside, there is a brief fluctuation in wind intensity. The cabin responds with a slow, unified creak that travels across its structure. It is not a sign of instability, but of adaptation. The building is adjusting continuously to maintain equilibrium under shifting pressure. You listen without focusing on any single sound. Instead, you allow the entire soundscape to exist at once. The effect is cumulative rather than segmented. No individual element dominates. Everything contributes equally to the overall impression of sustained movement and containment. Time continues without clear segmentation. You do not track it. You experience it as continuity rather than sequence. The cabin remains warm, the storm remains active, and your awareness moves between them without urgency, anchored in a space defined not by change, but by endurance and steady persistence. The night outside has reached a kind of settled intensity, where nothing feels like it is beginning or ending. It simply continues. The cabin stands within it like a fixed point that the world flows around, not against. You remain seated near the stove, watching the fire maintain its steady rhythm, each small movement of flame casting slow arcs of light across the worn interior. There is a subtle change in how the space feels now. Earlier, the cabin felt like shelter from the storm. Now it feels more like a participant in it, not by choice, but by necessity. The wind does not simply strike it. It passes through it in pressure, shaping the sound, the vibration, even the perception of stillness inside. You adjust your posture slightly, feeling the straw mattress shift beneath you with a faint rustle. The sound is small, but in this environment it carries weight. Everything does. The absence of competing noise has made every internal detail more pronounced, as if the cabin has narrowed its focus into finer resolution. Outside, the snow continues its relentless accumulation. The window shows almost no distinction between sky and ground anymore. It is a single field of movement, a soft brightness that occasionally darkens in uneven patches. Those variations could be tris, could be drifted snow, could simply be wind patterns folding through space. The uncertainty no longer feels urgent, it feels normal. You stand and walk toward the stove again. The floorboards respond with a familiar sequence of creaks. You have begun to recognize the pattern of sound across different areas of the cabin. Certain planks react more sharply, others more slowly, as if each has its own temperament under pressure and temperature change. A widely accepted understanding of frontier winter environments highlights how cabins in the mid-19th century often developed what could be called internal sound identities. Logs, joints, and insulation materials all contributed to a unique acoustic profile that changed with weather conditions. This is supported by structural studies of surviving log buildings, though the lived interpretation of those sounds varied widely depending on individual experience and environmental severity. You place a hand briefly near the stove, the heat radiates in uneven layers again, strongest near the iron surface. Fading gradually into the room, you find yourself instinctively adjusting distance based on comfort rather than thought. This kind of spatial behavior, where heat becomes a central organizing principle of movement, is frequently observed in accounts of isolated winter habitation. A small frontier observation preserved in oral storytelling traditions describes how some settlers believed that storms could thicken indoor air pressure, making breathing feel slightly different during peak snowfall periods. While modern science attributes such sensations to ventilation changes and temperature differentials, the perception itself appears repeatedly in written recollections from the period, suggesting it was a common subjective experience even if not physically measurable in the way it was described. You return to your seat again. The repetition of movement within the cabin has become less deliberate and more cyclical. You do not decide to move so much as respond to small environmental cues. Warmth, sound, comfort, silence, each becomes a prompt for adjustment. The stove emits a steady ticking sound as it continues to expand and contract with heat. It is subtle but constant, forming at a rhythmic undercurrent beneath everything else. The fire's glow reflects faintly on the table, where the tin cup remains unmoved. Its stillness continues to act as a reference point in a space where almost everything else feels in motion. Outside, the storm reaches another phase of uniformity. There are no longer distinguishable gusts or breaks in wind. It has become a continuous pressure field, shaping snow into motion without variation. This consistency creates a strange effect inside the cabin, where external unpredictability is replaced by a sustained environmental baseline. You notice how your hearing has adapted further. Smaller internal sounds become easier to distinguish, the faint shifting of straw, the soft expansion of wood beams, even the slight sound of fabric as you adjust your posture. These details form a kind of internal acoustic landscape that exists parallel to the storm outside. A lesser-known detail from frontier accounts mentions that some settlers would leave small gaps in window coverings or door seals, not only for ventilation, but also to listen to external conditions more clearly. The idea was that controlled airflow could carry more distinct sound patterns from outside, allowing occupants to interpret wind strength and direction more accurately. Whether this was a widespread practice or regionally specific adaptation is unclear, but it appears often enough in personal writings to suggest practical experimentation with environmental perception. You lean forward slightly, resting your elbows on your knees. The firelight shifts across the floor in slow motion. The room feels both stable and subtly responsive, as if it is adjusting itself continuously to maintain equilibrium with external forces. Outside, there is a brief fluctuation in sound, not a change in intensity, but in texture. The wind seems to flatten for a moment, then regain its layered structure. This shift is subtle but noticeable. It creates a sense of recalibration, as if the storm is reorganizing its internal movement patterns. You do not react immediately. Instead, you simply register it and let it pass. The cabin remains warm. The stove remains steady. The storm remains active. Between them, your awareness moves without urgency, following rather than directing attention. A widely documented feature of frontier living during extended winter storms is the gradual reduction of perceived novelty and environmental change. Early shifts in weather feel distinct and noticeable. Over time, those changes compress into a continuous background condition. This phenomenon is well supported by both historical observation and modern studies of sensory adaptation in prolonged exposure environments. You stand once more and walk toward the window. Frost now covers nearly all remaining transparency. Only faint gradients of brightness remain visible. The outside world has become fully abstracted into motion and light variation. You place your hand lightly against the glass. It is cold enough to feel immediate and direct. The contrast between interior warmth and exterior cold remains sharp. Even as visual separation has disappeared, a small frontier observation passed through regional storytelling describes how settlers sometimes marked storm progression by the sound of animals disappearing from auditory range rather than visual disappearance. As conditions worsened, wildlife sounds would fade gradually rather than stop abruptly, creating a layered sense of retreat from the environment. Whether this reflects actual behavioral patterns or interpretive memory is uncertain, but it appears consistently in narrative accounts from isolated regions. You step back from the window. The cabin feels unchanged, but your awareness of it has deepened. The stove, the table, the bed, the walls all feel more defined, not because they have changed, but because everything outside them has become less distinguishable. The storm continues without interruption. The night continues without segmentation. And within the cabin, you remain in a steady loop of warmth, sound, and observation, where nothing demands urgency, and everything simply persists. The cabin feels different now in a way that is hard to point to directly. Nothing has moved, nothing has changed shape, and yet the atmosphere carries a deeper weight, as if the storm outside has pressed itself closer against the walls and decided to stay there for a while without explanation. You remain seated near the stove, though your posture has softened. The sharp attentiveness you held earlier has begun to fade into something quieter, more continuous. The fire still burns, but it no longer feels like a central event. It feels like part of the environment, steady and questioned. A small contained sun that has accepted its role for the night. Outside, the storm continues its uninterrupted motion. Snow is no longer something you imagine falling. It is something you assume is always present, always moving, always reshaping the unseen landscape beyond the logs. The window offers no resistance to this idea anymore. Frost has fully claimed it, leaving only vague light variations that any recognizable shapes. You stand slowly and move across the room. Your steps are measured not out of caution, but out of habit formed by uneven floorboards and the quiet awareness that sound carries differently in enclosed wooden structures. Each movement produces a soft creak that disappears quickly into the thicker background of wind pressure. You notice how the cabin seems to respond less to individual sounds now, and more to general changes in pressure. It is subtle, but noticeable in the way beams adjust and joints settle. The structure is not fragile. It is simply in constant conversation with the environment outside. A well-established understanding of frontier construction emphasizes how log cabins were designed to flex rather than resist rigidly. Builders often accepted that seasonal shifts would cause expansion and contraction in the wood. That adaptability was part of survival architecture in regions where winter conditions were not occasional but expected cycles of life. This understanding is supported by structural studies of surviving frontier buildings. Though lived experiences of those spaces varied depending on climate intensity and resource availability. You pause near the table again, The tin cup remains exactly where it has been all night. Its stillness feels increasingly symbolic, not because it carries meaning of its own, but because it contrasts so sharply with the constant motion outside. The cabin seems to have reduced itself into a handful of stable objects, each one anchoring perception. You sit again, letting your weight settle into the edge of the bed. The straw shifts beneath you with a dry, faint sound. It is almost delicate compared to everything else in the room. The mattress holds its shape, but not rigidly. It adjusts slightly, accommodating you without resistance. Outside, the wind shifts direction once more. You feel it not as a change in temperature, but as a change in how the cabin sounds. One side of the structure deepens in tone, while another lightens. It is as if the building is listening differently depending on where pressure is applied. A quiet frontier observation passed down through regional storytelling describes how some settlers believed cabins had preferred sides during storms. They would claim that certain walls carried wind more easily, creating subtle differences in sound that helped predict shifts in weather intensity. Modern interpretation suggests this diastole reflects variations in construction and exposure, but the consistency of the observation across multiple accounts suggests it was a commonly perceived experience. You lean back slightly and close your eyes, without visual input. The soundscape becomes more layered. The stove produces a steady internal rhythm of heat expansion and cooling contraction. The wind outside forms a continuous backdrop that feels less like individual gusts and more like a single sustained pressure field. Beneath it all, there are smaller sounds, wood settling, fabric shifting, your own breathing. Time becomes less structured in this state. You are no longer tracking it. You are moving through it without reference points. This kind of temporal diffusion is often noted in accounts of prolonged isolation in winter environments, where external cues disappear and internal rhythms become more dominant. You open your eyes again. The cabin remains unchanged, but your perception of it has become more intimate. The stove is no longer just a heat source. It is a presence. The walls are not just boundaries, they are participants in the night. Even the air feels layered. Warmer near the fire, cooler near the edges, each zone blending into the next without clear separation. Outside, the storm reaches a moment of sustained uniformity. There is no escalation, no retreat, just continuation. Snow and wind merge into a single environmental condition that feels stable in its persistence rather than variable in its intensity. You stand once more and move toward the stove. The heat greets you immediately, a familiar gradient of warmth that you instinctively adjust to. You have begun to position yourself in relation to it without conscious planning. Movement inside the cabin has become guided by thermal comfort as much as by intention. A lesser-known detail preserved in frontier oral accounts describes how settlers sometimes developed what they called heat memory, a sense of remembering where warmth would be strongest in a room at different times of night based on stove behavior and wind direction. While not scientifically defined, this concept appears repeatedly in personal recollections, suggesting a form of environmental attunement shaped by necessity. You add a small piece of wood to the stove. The flame responds briefly, brightening before settling back into a steady burn. The sound it produces is soft but immediate, a short-lived increase in crackling that fades into background rhythm. You return to your seat and allow your shoulders to relax slightly. The repetition of movement has become almost unconscious. Sit, stand, adjust, listen. The cabin has structured your behavior into small cycles that respond to comfort and sound rather than deliberate planning. Outside, the storm continues without visible change. The absence of variation has become its own form of presence. You no longer wait for it to shift, you accept it as ongoing. A widely recognized aspect of frontier winter experience involves how prolonged storms altered perception of enclosure. People often described a gradual fading of boundary awareness, where interior and exterior began to feel less distinct emotionally. even if physically unchanged. This was not confusion but adaptation, a way of maintaining stability in conditions where external reference points disappeared for extended periods. You look toward the window again. It offers nothing but faint brightness and motion. The forest is no longer a place you can locate. It is a condition that exists beyond direct perception. You exhale slowly and notice how the sound of your breath feels slightly amplified in the quiet interior. Not louder, but clearer. The cabin filters sound rather than suppressing it, shaping it into a more defined internal acoustic space. The fire continues its steady rhythm. The stove continues its quiet expansion. The storm continues its uniform motion. Between them, you remain in a narrow zone of warmth and containment that feels increasingly detached from anything beyond the logs. There is a moment where everything feels suspended, not paused, but balanced in such a way that nothing demands attention more than anything else. The cabin holds its shape, the storm holds its presence, and you remain within both, moving only as much as necessary, listening without urgency, existing without pressure to interpret what comes next. The storm outside has settled into something almost architectural now, as if it is no longer weather, but a structure built around the cabin. You notice it not through change, but through persistence. The wind no longer arrives in identifiable moments, it simply exists, pressing against everything at once, shaping the night into a continuous field of movement. You remain near the stove, though your attention drifts in and out of focus. The fire continues its steady work, no longer demanding attention but still defining the room. Its light moves across the walls in slow arcs, revealing the same familiar textures over and over again. The logs, the seams, the uneven surfaces of hand-built timber all feel more pronounced now, as if the cabin is slowly revealing its construction history under prolonged observation. Outside, visibility has completely collapsed. There is no longer any suggestion of distance through the window, only layered brightness, shifting in density without forming recognizable shapes. The forest, the ground, the horizon, all of it exists now, only as inference rather than perception. You stand and walk slowly across the room. The floor responds with a sequence of soft creaks that feel increasingly familiar. You have come to recognize the cabin not as a silent space, but as one that communicates constantly through subtle sound. Each board, each beam, each joint contributes to a low-level acoustic language shaped by pressure and heat. A well-established understanding of frontier construction highlights how log structures in the 19th century were intentionally built with flexibility in mind. Seasonal expansion and contraction were expected, not considered defects. Builders relied on natural settling processes to stabilize structures over time. This approach is well documented in architectural studies of early American homesteads, though lived experiences varied depending on region, materials, and storm exposure. You pause near the table again. The tin cup is still there, unchanged, but it feels increasingly like a marker of continuity rather than utility. In a space where everything outside is fluid and unstructured, static objects become reference points for perception itself. You sit on the edge of the bed. The straw compresses beneath your weight with a soft, rustling sound that seems louder than it should be. The mattress shifts slightly, adjusting to your position. You notice how even this small movement produces a response in the cabin's acoustic environment. Outside, the storm shifts in tone again, not intensity, but texture. The wind feels less segmented and more uniform, as if individual gusts have merged into a continuous layer. This change is subtle but perceptible through the way the cabin responds. One wall creaks more consistently than before, suggesting a sustained direction of pressure. A lesser-known detail from frontier oral traditions describes how some settlers believed they could identify the mood of a storm by listening to the rhythm of structural responses in their homes. Slow, Even creaking was associated with steady snowfall, while irregular patterns were interpreted as shifting winds or changing storm phases. While modern interpretation explains this through structural mechanics, the consistency of these accounts suggests it was a meaningful interpretive framework for those living in such environments. You lean forward slightly, resting your elbows on your knees. The firelight flickers across the floorboards, revealing small imperfection in the wood grain. Knots, seams, and subtle variations in texture become more visible under shifting illumination. The cabin feels increasingly like a record of its own construction, each surface holding evidence of labour and material origin. Time feels less structured again. There are no external markers to divide it into clear segments. Instead, it flows as continuity. You're not counting moments, you are moving through them. The stove ticks softly as it expands and contracts with heat. The sound is steady, almost metronomic. Though not precise enough to function as a clock, it provides rhythm without measurement. That rhythm becomes part of your internal awareness, a background pulse against which everything else is experienced. Outside, the storm maintains its uniform presence. There is no indication of change, only continuation. Snow and wind merge into a single environmental state that no longer distinguishes between individual elements. You stand again and move toward the stove. The heat is immediate, surrounding your hands in a familiar gradient. You adjust your position slightly without thinking, finding the point where warmth feels most balanced. This behavior has become automatic, shaped by repeated exposure to uneven heat distribution. A small frontier observation preserved in regional storytelling describes how settlers sometimes use the direction of smoke movement inside cabins to interpret subtle shifts in wind pressure outside. Even minor changes in airflow could alter smoke behavior, creating visible indicators of external conditions. While modern ventilation understanding explains these effects mechanically, the observation itself reflects a consistent attempt to read environmental change through indirect signs. You return to your seat again. The repetition of movement inside the cabin has become less conscious, more responsive. The space encourages certain patterns simply through its structure and heat distribution. Outside, the storm reaches a sustained plateau of uniformity. It neither intensifies nor weakens. It continues. That continuation becomes its defining characteristic rather than any specific behavior. You close your eyes briefly, without visual input. The cabin becomes entirely sound-defined. The stove's soft burn, the wind's continuous pressure, the subtle shifting of wood under stress. Each sound layer becomes more distinct when separated from visual distraction. Environmental studies of historical isolation environments suggest that prolonged exposure to such conditions often leads to increased auditory sensitivity. This is not an active adaptation, but a gradual shift in attention weighting, where sound becomes the primary source of environmental information. That phenomenon is consistent with both modern sensory research and historical descriptions from frontier experiences. You open your eyes again, the cabin remains unchanged in structure, but not in perception. It feels more defined, as if each object has gained clarity through repetition of observation rather than any physical alteration. The fire continues its steady cycle. The stove maintains its low expansion rhythm. The table, bed, and walls remain fixed in place, yet their presence feels increasingly layered, as if each carries accumulated memory of observation throughout the night. Outside there is a faint shift in pressure. The cabin responds with a slow, unified creak that travels across its structure. It is not a disruption but an adjustment, a redistribution of load across the frame. The sound fades quickly back into baseline noise. You sit quietly, letting the environment stabilize again. The storm remains present, the cabin remains steady. Between them, you exist in a space defined not by change, but by continuous persistence, where nothing ends and nothing begins, only continues in steady rhythm without interruption. The night feels deeper now, not in darkness alone, but in density, as if the air itself has thickened into layers that press gently against the cabin from all sides. You sit near the stove, though even that familiar position feels slightly different tonight, like the room has subtly adjusted its proportions without moving anything at all. The fire is lower than before, reduced to a concentrated core of glowing embers and occasional small tongues of flame that rise and fall without urgency. It still provides warmth, but now that warmth feels more localized, more selective. You notice how it clings to certain parts of the room while allowing others to drift back into coolness. The cabin is no longer evenly heated. It is divided into temperature zones that shift slowly with the fire's behavior. Outside, the storm continues without interruption. There is no sense of beginning or escalation anymore. It simply persists, as though it has reached a state where variation is unnecessary. The wind presses against the logs in a continuous presence, and the snow, though invisible, announces itself through sound and pressure rather than sight. You become aware of how the cabin communicates this external force. It does not shake or tremble dramatically. Instead, it responds in subtle structural language. A beam adjusts slightly. A joint releases a faint sound. The ceiling carries a soft, shifting tone that travels across its length like a slow wave. These are not signs of instability. They are signs of adaptation. You stand and move slowly across the room. The floor feels different underfoot now. Not in texture, but in responsiveness. Certain boards react more quickly than others, creating a familiar sequence of sounds that you have started to recognize as part of the cabin's internal map. Movement here is never silent, but it has become predictable in its unpredictability. A faint memory surfaces of how frontier homes were often described as living systems in older personal accounts, not because they moved intentionally, but because they changed in response to environment in ways that occupants learned to interpret. That idea is not framed as mythology in those writings, but as observations shaped by necessity. When external conditions are constant pressure, even wood begins to feel expressive. You pause near the table again. The tin cup remains in its place, unchanged. Its stillness feels more pronounced than ever, as if it is anchoring the entire room through its refusal to participate in the subtle shifts happening around it. Nearby objects seem to orient themselves around that stillness, without conscious arrangement. You sit on the edge of the bed. The straw mattress compresses with a dry, soft sound, and for a moment you notice how many tiny noises exist within the cabin that you would normally ignore. Fabric shifting, wood adjusting, air moving through unseen gaps in the logs. Each sound is small, but together they form a continuous interior texture. Outside, the wind changes its behavior slightly, not in strength, but in structure. It moves in longer passes now, as if the storm has reorganized itself into extended cycles rather than scattered bursts. The cabin responds accordingly, producing a deeper, more unified creaking pattern that travels across its frame. You close your eyes for a moment. Without sight, the cabin becomes entirely acoustic. The fire emits a slow, steady sequence of pops and soft collapses as wood shifts within the heat. The wind outside forms a layered background that is no longer segmented into distinct gusts but perceived as a continuous field. Beneath it all, your own breathing becomes more noticeable, not because it has changed, but because everything else has simplified. This kind of sensory narrowing is often described in historical accounts of prolonged winter isolation. People living in remote frontier conditions frequently noted that their awareness of sound intensified during storms, especially when visual input was limited for extended periods. Modern interpretation suggests this is a natural attentional shift when one sensory channel dominates environmental information. You open your eyes again. The room looks slightly altered. though nothing has physically changed. It is the lighting that creates this impression. The fire has dimmed further, and shadows have grown broader, stretching across walls and floorboards in slow, shifting shapes. You adjust the logs in the stove carefully. The fire responds with a brief brightening, then settles again into a lower burn. The warmth increases for a moment, then redistributes itself unevenly across the room. You instinctively move slightly closer to the heat source, following comfort without conscious planning. Outside, the storm reaches a moment of sustained uniformity. There is no fluctuation in intensity that you can distinguish anymore. Instead, it becomes a single continuous presence, a pressure field that defines everything beyond the cabin without offering detail. You return to your seat and lean back slightly. The cabin feels more enclosed now, not because it has physically tightened, but because your awareness of its boundaries has become more acute. The walls feel closer, not in distance, but in definition. A small observation, preserved in frontier oral tradition, describes how some settlers claimed they could feel changes in storm direction through subtle shifts in indoor temperature before any sound or visible sign occurred. While modern understanding attributes such sensations to airflow and insulation behavior, the consistency of these accounts suggests that environmental sensitivity was a well-developed survival skill in isolated conditions. You listen again. The storm outside has not checked its presence, but its texture feels smoother now, less varied. It is as if multiple layers of motion have aligned into a single, sustained movement. The stove ticks softly as metal contracts slightly, then expands again. That sound has become one of the most stable references inside the cabin. It is small, but consistent enough to create rhythm in the absence of external structure. You stand once more and walk toward the window. Frost now covers nearly every surface. The glass is opaque except for faint gradients of brightness that shift slowly without forming shape or depth. The outside world is no longer visible in any direct sense. It is inferred through sound alone. You place your hand lightly against the glass. The cold transfers immediately. Sharp and direct, the contrast between interior warmth and exterior cold remains one of the few clear boundaries still perceptible without interpretation. A quiet detail from regional storytelling traditions suggests that during prolonged storms, some homesteaders began to rely more heavily on interior sound patterns than external observation to maintain awareness of environmental change. The creaking of wood, the direction of airflow inside a room, and the behavior of fire all became indirect indicators of what lay beyond the walls. You step away from the window again. The cabin feels steady, but not static. Everything inside it is in a state of slow response to external pressure. Nothing is still in the absolute sense. It is all in balance. You sit down once more near the stove. The fire continues its controlled cycle, now reduced to a compact source of heat and light. The room has settled into a quiet equilibrium where movement is minimal and perception is focused. Outside, the storm continues without variation. It does not demand attention anymore. It simply exists as continuity. Between the steady warmth inside and the unbroken motion outside, you remain in a narrow space where time is no longer measured in distinct moments, but experienced as ongoing presence. Nothing arrives, nothing leaves, everything continues. The cabin no longer feels like it sits inside the storm. It feels like the storm has gathered itself around the cabin and decided to remain there, holding position with patient pressure. There is no sense of approach anymore, no sense of arrival. Everything outside has already arrived, and now it simply continues existing in motion. You are still near the stove, though the distinction between sitting and standing has begun to feel less important. The fire has reduced to a concentrated core of glowing heat, pulsing gently as each log settles into its final stages of combustion. The light it produces is softer now, lower, more intimate, and it no longer reaches the corners of the room with any confidence. Outside, the storm reaches its most unified state. The wind does not shift in direction so much as it circulates, wrapping around the cabin in overlapping currents. Snow is no longer something that falls. It is something that moves continuously in all available space, carried and reshaped by pressure that never pauses. You notice how sound has changed again earlier. There were layers you could separate if you listened closely. Now everything has merged into a single continuous tone, not loud in the sense of force, but total in presence. It fills the perception of outside entirely, leaving no gaps where silence can form. Inside, the cabin responds in its own slow language. The beams overhead emit a deeper, more sustained creak. The walls adjust in small increments, not reacting sharply but continuously accommodating pressure. The structure feels less like a barrier and more like a negotiator, maintaining balance through constant minor movement. You stand and walk slowly towards the window. The glass is completely obscured now. Frost patterns have thickened into layered formations that erase any remaining transparency. What was once a view is now a surface of shifting texture, illuminated faintly by firelight and the diffuse brightness of the storm beyond. You place your hand against the glass. The cold is immediate and absolute, spreading through your fingers with sharp clarity. It does not linger as sensation, it replaces it. The boundary between inside and outside becomes most evident not visually, but physically. A long observed detail in historical accounts of frontier winter living describes how storms of this intensity often produced a sense of spatial flattening. Without visible reference points, distance loses its usual meaning. People writing from isolated cabins often describe the outside world as pressed close rather than far away, as if weather compressed geography into a single surrounding layer. That perception is consistent across multiple regions, suggesting it was a common experiential response to heavy winter conditions. You withdraw your hand from the glass and step back. The cabin feels warmer by comparison, though the temperature has not changed. It is perception that has shifted, not environment. The contrast between interior and exterior has sharpened into something almost absolute. You return to the stove and add a small piece of wood. The reaction is immediate. The flame rises slightly, brightens, then settles again into its steady rhythm. The sound of combustion becomes briefly more active before returning to a low, controlled burn. Heat spreads outward in uneven gradients, touching your hands, then your face, then fading toward the walls. You notice how your attention now moves almost entirely between 2 points, the stove and the storm. Everything else exists between them in diminishing relevance. Outside. The storm reaches what feels like its most stable intensity. There is no escalation, no reduction, only continuity. The sound becomes less varied, more uniform, as if multiple movements have synchronized into a single extended presence. You sit again on the edge of the bed. The straw shifts beneath you with a dry softness that feels louder than it should. The mattress adjusts slowly to your weight, releasing a faint rustling sound that disappears quickly into the broader noise of the cabin. Your breathing becomes more noticeable in this environment, not because it has changed, but because external variation has narrowed. Each inhale and exhale feels distinct against the steady background of storm and fire. A small observation passed down through frontier storytelling traditions describes how some settlers believed storms at their peak created a kind of auditory sameness inside enclosed spaces, where all sounds seem to blend into a continuous field unless actively focused upon. Modern interpretations suggest this reflects both environmental acoustics and cognitive adaptation to sustained sensory input, though the subjective experience remains consistently described in historical recollections. You lean forward slightly, resting your elbows on your knees. The firelight shifts across the floorboards, revealing textures in the wood that were not noticeable earlier. Grain patterns, small imperfections, and subtle variations in construction become more visible under the changing angle of light. The cabin feels increasingly like a closed system, not sealed in a strict sense, but complete in its internal logic. Everything inside is adapted to the presence of everything else. Nothing interrupts, everything responds. Outside, the wind shifts slightly in structure, and the cabin answers with a long, unified creak that travels across its entire frame. The sound is not sudden. It unfolds slowly, as if the structure is releasing tension across multiple points at once. You close your eyes for a moment. Without sight, the soundscape becomes fully dimensional. The stove provides a steady internal rhythm. The wind outside forms a continuous layered pressure. The cabin itself adds a middle layer of structural sound, slow and responsive, beneath all of it. Your own breathing becomes another measured component in the environment. Time feels less segmented again. There are no distinct moments to mark its passage, only continuation, only ongoing presence without interruption. You open your eyes. The room appears unchanged, yet somehow more defined, not clearer but more familiar. Each object has settled into its role within the space with greater certainty. The stove is heat, the table is stability, the bed is rest. The walls are containment. Outside, the storm continues at full presence. It does not demand attention. It simply occupies all available space beyond the logs. There is a brief fluctuation in sound, almost imperceptible, a slight reduction in density, followed by immediate return. You notice it not as an event, but as a contrast against the continuity that has formed around it. You stand again and move towards the stove. The heat meets you immediately, a familiar gradient that your body adjusts to without thought. You remain within its radius for a moment, then shift slightly to maintain balance between warmth and comfort. The cabin continues its quiet structural adjustments. The storm continues its unbroken movement. Between them, you exist in a narrow band of stability where nothing changes sharply and everything persists without beginning or end. Outside, the storm holds its peak state. Inside, the fire holds its steady rhythm, and in the space between those two conditions, the night continues without distinction, without interruption, and without any need to resolve itself into anything else. Something about the storm begins to feel different now, though nothing changes in any obvious way. The wind still presses against the cabin with its continuous weight. The snow still moves in unseen layers beyond the walls. The fire still burns in its slow, controlled rhythm. And yet, there is a subtle shift in how it all feels, as if the storm has reached a point where it is no longer building or maintaining, but simply continuing out of habit. You remain seated near the stove. The heat is lower now, more concentrated, but still reliable. It no longer fills the entire room evenly. Instead, it forms a central pocket of warmth that you adjust to, rather than depend on fully. The edges of the cabin feel cooler again, though not sharply so, more like a gradual retreat of warmth into itself. The fire crackles softly, but even that sound feels subdued, not weaker, just more contained. Each pop of wood and shift of ember feels absorbed into the room more quickly than before, as if the cabin is beginning to conserve sound as well as heat. Outside, the storm maintains its presence. There is no indication of decline, but there is also no further escalation. The wind has settled into a long, continuous movement, and the snow, though invisible, is implied through the density of sound and pressure against the logs. You stand and move slowly across the room again. The floorboards respond in their familiar pattern, but you notice something different in how they feel underfoot. The cabin seems more settled, less reactive. The earlier sense of continuous structural adjustment has softened into a steadier equilibrium. A widely recognized aspect of historical frontier living involves how prolonged winter storms often created periods of perceptual adaptation. where occupants became less reactive to environmental variation. In such conditions, changes that would normally be noticeable begin to feel absorbed into a continuous baseline. This is well supported by both environmental psychology and historical accounts of isolated homesteads, where individuals describe a gradual flattening of perceived contrast between events. You pause near the table again. The tin cup remains unchanged, still catching faint reflections of firelight. It continues to function as a visual anchor in a space where most other details have softened or blended into repetition. You sit on the edge of the bed. The straw shifts beneath you, but the sound feels quieter than before. Not physically quieter, but less distinct. You notice how the cabin seems to be reducing the sharpness of its own internal noise. Everything feels slightly more blended together. Outside, the storm continues without interruption, yet the sound has subtly changed character again. It is less layered now, less complex. Earlier, you could sense multiple levels within it. Now it feels more unified, as if the storm has simplified itself into a single sustained presence. You close your eyes briefly. The fire becomes a low rhythmic pulse. The wind becomes a continuous field. The cabin becomes a container of faint structural responses. Your breathing becomes part of this system, not dominant, but present within the same shared acoustic environment. There is a lesser-known detail from frontier oral tradition that describes how some settlers believed storms reached a quiet center during their peak intensity, where the sound stopped changing and instead became uniform. While this idea is not supported by modern meteorological understanding, it appears in multiple regional accounts, suggesting it reflected a perceptual experience rather than a physical condition of the storm itself. You open your eyes again. The cabin remains unchanged, but your awareness of it has shifted slightly. The room feels less like a collection of objects and more like a single continuous environment. The stove, table, bed, and walls feel less separate than before. You stand and walk toward the stove. The heat is steady but reduced in spread. It concentrates near the source more than earlier, requiring you to position yourself more deliberately to remain within its comfortable range. You adjust without thinking, guided by habit formed over the course of the night. The fire emits a soft sequence of pops as another piece of wood settles. The sound is brief and quickly absorbed into the room. Shadows move across the walls in slow motion, but even those movements feel less pronounced than earlier in the night. Outside, the storm maintains its sustained presence. There is no visible variation through the window, only a uniform field of brightness and motion. The frost has fully overtaken any remaining transparency, leaving the glass as a boundary of texture rather than vision. You place your hand near the wall instead of the window. The logs feel cooler than expected, but stable. The cabin is no longer actively adjusting in noticeable ways. It feels as though it has reached a temporary equilibrium with the pressure outside. A small observation preserved in frontier storytelling describes how settlers sometimes interpreted moments of storm stability as holding periods, where the environment seemed to pause in variation even while continuing its motion. These interpretations were not literal, but reflective of how sustained exposure to uniform conditions alters perception of change over time. You return to your seat again. The repetition of movement has become almost unconscious. The cabin encourages minimal motion, each action returning you to one of a few stable positions defined by heat, seating, or observation. Time feels increasingly unstructured again. There are no clear markers to divide it, only continuity, only ongoing presence without segmentation. The stove ticks softly as metal contracts and expands. The sound is faint but consistent, providing a subtle rhythm beneath the broader soundscape. You notice how this internal rhythm now feels more prominent than the storm outside, even though the storm is objectively larger in scale. You lean back slightly and let your gaze drift upward toward the ceiling beams. They're unchanged, but the way you perceive them has deepened. Each joint and log connection feels more present, as if the structure has revealed more of itself through prolonged attention. Outside, the storm continues without variation. It does not demand interpretation anymore. It simply exists as ongoing condition. Inside, the fire continues its controlled cycle. The cabin continues its quiet structural responses, and between them, you remain in a space where perception has narrowed into continuity rather than change, where the night no longer advances but simply persists in a steady, unbroken state. The storm outside no longer feels like it is changing. It feels like it has settled into a complete state, one that does not require adjustment or development. The wind continues its long, uninterrupted movement, and the snow remains invisible but ever present in the way it reshapes every sound that reaches the cabin. Nothing begins, nothing ends, it all simply continues in a steady, unified presence. You sit near the stove, though even that position feels less defined now. The heat is still there, but it no longer creates a strong contrast against the rest of the room. Instead, it blends more gradually into the surrounding air, creating a softer gradient that spreads without clear boundaries. The fire has diminished further, not in reliability, but in brightness and reach. It burns low, steady and contained. The cabin itself feels more settled than before. Earlier in the night, it carried subtle signs of constant adjustment. Small creaks, shifting beams, faint structural responses to pressure. Now those signals have reduced in frequency. The structure feels as though it has found its balance with the storm outside, no longer reacting actively, but maintaining a quiet equilibrium. You stand slowly and walk across the room. The floorboards respond, but more gently than earlier. The sound of your movement feels absorbed quickly into the space. The cabin no longer amplifies its own internal noises. It seems to soften them, blending each sound into a single continuous background. A widely recognized pattern in historical accounts of frontier winter living describes how extended storms often led to what was later termed perceptual leveling, where differences between environmental sounds became less distinct over time. This was not a sudden shift, but a gradual adaptation observed across many isolated settlements. Individuals often recorded that once storms reached sustained intensity, their ability to distinguish individual environmental changes diminished, replaced instead by a sense of uniform auditory presence. You pause near the table again. The tin cup remains where it has been all night. It has become less of a focal point and more of a constant. Its stillness no longer contrasts sharply with the environment. Instead, it feels integrated into it, as though it belongs to the same state of continuity that defines everything else in the room. You sit on the edge of the bed. The straw shifts beneath you with a soft sound that feels less pronounced than before. Even your own movements seem quieter now, not in volume but in distinction. The cabin appears to be reducing contrast across all sensory input, smoothing differences between actions and reactions. Outside, the storm continues without visible variation. The wind does not rise or fall, it simply persists in a continuous flow. The snow remains unseen but implied in every sound that reaches the walls. There is no indication of direction or change, only presence. You close your eyes for a moment. The fire becomes a low, steady pulse. The stove emits faint metallic ticks as it adjusts to heat. The wind outside forms a continuous field of pressure. The cabin itself adds a subtle structural undertone, a slow rhythm of material responding to environment. Your breathing joins this layered system, no longer separate, but part of the same ambient structure. There is a lesser-known observation preserved in frontier storytelling traditions describing how some settlers believed that during the deepest stages of winter storms, sound itself could lose its edges, becoming more like a continuous texture than distinct events. While modern interpretation explains this through auditory masking and environmental acoustics, the subjective accounts consistently describe a similar flattening of sound structure. You open your eyes again. The cabin appears unchanged, but your perception of it has softened further. The boundaries between objects feel less rigid. The stove, table, bed, and walls are still present, but they feel less separated from each other than earlier in the night. The space between them seems to have narrowed in perceptual terms. You stand and move toward the stove again. The heat is still steady, but its reach is smaller. You position yourself closer to it without thinking, adjusting instinctively to maintain comfort. Movement within the cabin has become minimal and efficient, guided more by sensation than intention. The fire produces a soft crackle as another piece of wood settles. The sound is brief, quickly absorbed into the broader environment. Shadows move slowly across the walls, but even they feel subdued, as if the firelight itself has reduced its intensity over time. Outside, the storm maintains its continuous state. There is no variation in intensity or structure that can be distinguished anymore. It exists as a single unified presence beyond the logs. The window offers no information beyond faint brightness and motion without form. You place your hand near the wall again. The logs feel stable, neither shifting nor resisting in noticeable ways. The cabin seems to have reached a steady condition with the external pressure, no longer actively adjusting but maintaining a quiet balance. A small detail from regional frontier accounts describes how some homesteaders believed there were moments during long storms when the environment entered what they called even weather, a state in which all changes became so gradual that they were no longer perceptible without long comparison. While this concept has no formal scientific definition, it reflects a consistent experiential description found in multiple isolated settlements. You return to your seat. The repetition of movement has become almost unconscious. Sit, stand to stand, adjust, observe. Each action leads to a predictable result within the space, reinforcing a sense of continuity rather than change. Time feels increasingly unstructured again. There are no distinct markers of progression, only sustained presence. The storm outside continues without interruption. The cabin inside continues without disruption. Between them, your awareness moves in a steady rhythm that no longer requires direction. The stove ticks softly again. The sound is faint but consistent, providing the only measurable rhythm in the room. It does not define time, but it suggests it, a subtle pulse beneath everything else. You lean back slightly and allow your gaze to rest on the ceiling beams once more. The structure feels familiar in a deeper way now, not because it has changed, but because you have observed it long enough for its details to settle into memory. Each beam, each joint, each connection feels embedded in the space more clearly than before. Outside, the storm continues without deviation. It does not demand attention or interpretation. It simply exists as continuation. Inside, the fire maintains its steady glow. The cabin maintains its quiet structure, and between them, you remain in a narrow field of warmth and sound where nothing changes sharply, and everything persists in a continuous, unbroken state that defines the night more completely than any single moment within it. The storm outside has not ended, but something about it has shifted in character. It no longer feels like an approaching force or a surrounding pressure. It feels like it has become the background of everything, a continuous state that no longer announces itself because it has fully settled into existence. There is no sense of arrival left in it, only continuation. Inside the cabin, the fire has reached its quietest stage. The stove holds a small, steady core of heat, not bright enough to dominate the room, but consistent enough to define it. The glow is low now, spreading softly across the floorboards and barely reaching the far corners of the space. The room feels more still than it has at any earlier point in the night, though stillness is not exact. It's more like reduction, a narrowing of motion and sound into their simplest forms. You remain seated for a moment without moving. The silence is not complete, but it is layered in such a way that it no longer separates individual sounds easily. The stove ticks faintly. The wood settles occasionally with soft internal shifts. The wind outside continues its long, unified presence, now so steady it no longer feels like variation. Even your breathing blends into this environment without drawing attention to itself. You stand slowly and walk across the cabin. The movement feels lighter than before, not because your body has changed, but because the environment no longer responds sharply to it. The floor creaks in a familiar pattern, but even that sound feels softened, as if the cabin is conserving expression. You pause near the table again. The tin cup remains exactly where it has been all night. It is unchanged, but it no longer feels like a focal point. Instead, it feels like part of the room's continuity, no longer contrasting with anything around it. The same stillness that defines it now defines much of the cabin. You move toward the stove and adjust your position slightly. The heat is minimal but steady. It does not spread far anymore. It remains close to its source, forming a small, stable zone of warmth. You find yourself staying within it without conscious decision, as though the cabin has quietly guided your movement into its most comfortable arrangement. A widely observed feature in historical accounts of frontier winter isolation describes how prolonged exposure to storms often led to a gradual reduction in perceived environmental contrast. People living through extended weather events frequently noted that differences between sound, light, and temperature became less distinct over time. This was not described as confusion, but as a kind of leveling where everything in the environment began to feel more uniform. Such accounts appear across multiple regions and time periods, suggesting it was a common experiential adaptation rather than an isolated phenomenon. You sit again on the edge of the bed. The straw shifts softly beneath your weight, producing a faint rustling sound that quickly fades into the background. Even your own movements now seem less pronounced, as if the cabin has absorbed part of their definition. Nothing feels sharp anymore. Everything feels slightly softened. Outside, the storm continues in its steady, uninterrupted form. There is no visible indication of change through the window. Only faint brightness and motion remain, both abstract and undefined. The forest, the ground, and the horizon are no longer separate concepts. They exist only as assumptions beyond perception. You close your eyes briefly. The fire becomes a low, steady pulse. The stove emits faint metallic sounds as it continues its slow cycle of expansion and contraction. The wind outside forms a continuous field of motion that no longer breaks into identifiable parts. The cabin itself contributes a subtle structural rhythm, a long, quiet series of adjustments that are no longer individually noticeable. Your breathing becomes part of this same system, neither distinct nor dominant, simply present. In some frontier storytelling traditions, there are descriptions of what settlers called full weather nights. Moments when storms became so continuous that they stopped being interpreted as changing events and instead were experienced as a single extended condition. These descriptions are not uniform in detail, but they consistently reflect a sense of environmental continuity rather than episodic change. While modern environmental science interprets storms as dynamic systems, the subjective experience recorded in historical accounts often emphasizes this sense of sustained uniformity. You open your eyes again. The cabin remains unchanged, but the way you perceive it feels slightly different once more. The boundaries between objects are still present, but they feel less emphasized. The stove, the table, the bed, and the walls remain, but they exist more as parts of a single environment rather than separate elements. You stand and move toward the stove again. The warmth is faint but reliable. You remain close to it for a moment, then adjust your position slightly without thinking. Movement within the cabin has become minimal and responsive, guided by sensation rather than intention. The fire emits a final soft sequence of crackles as another piece of wood settles into its final burn stage. The sound is brief and quickly absorbed into the surrounding quiet. Shadows remain present but subdued, moving only slightly as the fire continues its low cycle. Outside, the storm continues without interruption. It does not intensify, it does not weaken. It simply persists. That persistence defines it more than any specific behaviour. It is no longer something happening outside the cabin, it is something that exists around it without distinction. You return to your seat. The repetition of movement has become part of a quiet, internal rhythm that no longer requires attention. Sit, stand, adjust, listen. These actions no longer feel separate, they feel continuous. Time is no longer structured in any clear way. There are no markers to divide it into segments, only ongoing presence. The cabin holds its warmth, the fire holds its glow, the storm holds its motion. Between them, you remain in a space where nothing begins and nothing ends, and everything simply continues in steady, uninterrupted existence. The night does not resolve, it does not conclude, it simply holds its form, and in that holding, everything remains as it is, without urgency, without change, and without the need for anything further. Sweet dreams.